And I would ask Trustee Cromer to lead us in the roll call, the Pledge of Allegiance. Okay, the Mendocino County Board of Retirement meeting for September 18th, 2024 is called to order at 8:37. Members of the public are welcome to address the board on subjects both on and off the agenda. Do we have any members of the public wishing to make comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay, so the first item, item one, the consent agenda. Oh, wait, we need to take a roll call here, right? Oh, and the proclamation is after. Oh, okay. My bad.
Mr. Kelly? Ms. Cavanis is absent. Mr. Cromer?
Here.
Mr. Shoemaker is also absent. Ms. Harris? Mr. Swope? Ms. Pierce?
Here.
Mr. Land?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, so I believe the first item, which is not here, is the proclamation honoring Trustee Gjerde. And I believe Doris was going to read this proclamation.
Mr. Gjerde was having a little difficulty logging in. Could we perhaps do the consent agenda while I see if I can reach him?
Okay, absolutely. Okay, all matters on the consent agenda are to be approved by one action without discussion unless a board member requests separate action on a specific item. Is anybody requesting specific action or requesting that an item be pulled for discussion? Okay, I do not believe anybody wishes to discuss any of the consent items, so it will be approved by unanimous consent. And that will take us to item number 2, historical benefit review project. Well, it says 2 on 3. All the numbers are going to be wrong, but okay. Historical benefit review project status report and project updates from Executive Director Rentschler. Oh.
Thank you, Chair Land. I'm pleased to announce that we did receive the compliance statement from the Internal Revenue Service regarding our application for voluntary correction. The compliance statement is attached to the items in your board materials. The action today is for the board to adopt a resolution conforming a couple of items that were modified during the review process with the IRS as outlined in the memo. The most significant change was regarding the correction for improper payments under forms of payments under divorce relations orders. The others were simply minor technical language corrections to conform with Secure 2.0, but they didn't have a material change to the application that we had submitted. So there is resolution number 24-05 that is for the board's adoption.
Do we have any board members, any discussion at this time? Yes?
So I'd just like to say, this brings an end to a very, very long
complex, I mean, one of the most complex projects I've ever worked on as an attorney. And I really wanted to give a lot of credit to our current director and staff, and to this board and to prior boards who've been involved. There were some bumps in the way, and anyway, really, it's quite an accomplishment, and it's great that we got to the finish line. It's been several years now. I just wanted to make those comments.
Is it truly over when we approve this?
No. The compliance statement gives us 150 days from the date that it was issued, was back in September. It did take us something like 37 days to actually receive it after the IRS issued it. We don't know what the delay there was, but we have a number of corrections that we're still working on. Then our goal is to try to complete as many of them before the due date, which is February 6th, with the hope that we won't need an extension, but I will know more in December.
But the IRS approval brings an end to it. It's true, there's still staff work to be done, but
the process for the board
Right.
essentially is wrapped up with this compliance statement from the Internal Revenue Service.
Is there any further comment? Yes. Trustee Harris. I believe that this is informational only? Or is there a motion?
To adopt.
Okay.
I'll second.
You might have to use this one.
Okay.
I thought there was a motion. Reading the wrong. Okay, I believe we would now take a roll call vote.
Mr. Kelly? Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Ms. Harris? Mr. Swope? Ms. Pierce?
Aye.
And Mr. Land?
Aye.
Approved. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to item 4.
I'm going to ask that you do 3B and then go back and we can do item 1 for the proclamation.
Okay, item 3B is,
That's informational only, and it is just receipt of the Historical Benefit Review Project Status Update Report showing the current work that was completed in the most recent month. If you have any questions regarding the report, I'm happy to answer any questions for you at this point. Mr. Swope?
What is the outstanding population of the cases that we still need to be working on?
I want to say it's in the neighborhood of 80, plus or minus. I don't have the exact count in front of me, and some of those are combined corrections that have several issues to be resolved. But we were holding them until we could get the determination on whether or not the IRS would accept the retroactive confirmation of our plan document. And now that we've addressed that, we can deal with the rest of the issues on the account.
Thank you.
On the resolution that we just approved, it showed 74 remaining issues or accounts or corrections, and 56 were purchase issues, 8 were non-purchase issues, and 10 were DROs.
Thank you, Trustee Cromer.
okay, I have kind of a conflict on my 2 agendas that I'm attempting to read this from. I believe we are now on item 4.
But we can note that the proclamation is being issued to Dan for his service on the board, if you'd like to do that at this point in time.
Okay, yes, let's head back to item 1, proclamation honoring Dan Gjerde for his service to the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association Board of Retirement.
Thank you. And I apologize if the annotated agenda differed. I just grabbed it and updated it for my apologies.
I will do my best.
Proclamation of the Mendocino County Board of Retirement honoring Dan Gjerde for his service to the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association and the Board of Retirement. Whereas Dan Gjerde has been a dedicated Board of Retirement trustee since January 1st, 2015, following his appointment by the Mendocino County Board of Supervisors. Dan has served as board chair and vice chair, audit committee chair, and was a member of the Strategic Plan Board Project Ad Hoc Committee. Whereas Dan's experience serving as the 4th District Supervisor for Mendocino County, serving multiple county and regional boards, and his valuable knowledge of local governance, combined with a mindful approach to policies, procedures, and fiduciary duty, and true dedication to Mendocino County and the members of the Mendocino County Employees Retirement Association, MCERA, have been a true asset to the board. Whereas Dan has always demonstrated confidence, has shared his honest opinion, and expressed a true interest in MCERA's long-term stability, Dan's pleasant demeanor and collegiality has been appreciated by fellow trustees and MCERA staff. Whereas Dan has participated in resolving many different matters as a trustee and has been guided by the principles of fiduciary duty when making decisions regarding consultants, policies, and investments, aiding in addressing difficult issues such as the Historical Benefit Review Project. Whereas Dan's many contributions to MCERA include development of the 5-year strategic plan and information technology master plan, receipt of an agreeable Internal Revenue Service compliance statement, advocating for enhanced member outreach and retirement education, and adoption of Article 8.4 regarding separate account divisions for community property interests. Now therefore be it resolved that the Mendocino County Board of Retirement sincerely thanks Dan for his many years of service and expresses its appreciation. Dan is truly wished a happy and prosperous future, dated this November 20th of 2024.
Okay, thank you. What is the next step on this? Is there any board comment?
You can ask for board comment, and there is no action on this item. After board and public comment, then it would be to item number 4 on the agenda.
Okay, does anybody wish to make a comment? I would want to make a comment and just call out Dan Gjerde's, Trustee Gjerde's habit of preparation for these meetings. He set a high standard. I wish I had the ability to come to these meetings as prepared as he always seemed to come to these meetings. And we didn't always, agree on items, but he definitely had a viewpoint, and he definitely could support it with a lot of independent research. So I believe now we can move on to item number 4. And I actually have the October annotations here. If somebody can get me the November annotations, I finally realized why the items were not lining up. And so this is Andy Young going to begin with 4A, I believe.
Thank you, Chair Land. Good morning, members of the Retirement Board. My name is Andy Young. I'm joined by my partner, Todd Towser. As agendized, we're here to present to you the June 30, 2024 valuation, which, if approved by the board, would set the contribution rate for the employer and the employees for the upcoming 2025-26 fiscal year. Now, before I actually dive into the results, I would ask my partner to do that. I have 2 pieces of exciting news that I'd like to share with you. My other partner, Paul Angelo, whom I have known professionally for the last 40 years, have finally decided to retire starting October 1st. So that's why you will be seeing a lot of Todd in addition to Andy Young. So I think with that as a backdrop, and I know that some of the board members may have had a chance to talk to Todd at some of the conferences, SACRIS conference that you've attended, but I would like to borrow a few minutes of your time and maybe ask Todd to formally introduce himself.
Well, good morning, members of the board. As Andy said, my name is Todd Towser, and I'm happy to be here. Quick background on myself is, on my career, is I worked at CalPERS for the first 10 years of my career. Paul Angelo always held that against me, working for CalPERS. So I finished my time there as a senior pension actuary in charge of asset liability management and risk. That's always been my focus in my career is risk. I got my actuarial fellowship in enterprise risk management with a focus on pension plans. And because of that focus, I left CalPERS and I went to S&P Global Ratings on the public finance side of things. They were trying to better understand pensions, so they created a position called Director of Municipal Pensions, and they hired me into that position. And so I was able to teach about 100 municipal analysts the key risks and key mechanics of pension plans. And then we developed a way to go evaluate public pension plans across the U.S. So across all 50 states, we're looking at pension plans. What are they doing well? What are they doing not so well? What kind of decisions have been made in the past that led to where they were today, and what kind of decisions were being made today? What might that lead to in the future? So that was a very interesting time period. I did that for a few years, and then about 5.5 years ago, I joined Andy and Paul at Siegel. And in addition to working on plans on the West Coast, I'm also Siegel's National Public Sector Retirement Practice Leader. So I help lead our practice in terms of the pension plans we work on across the United States. So we see a lot of variety in the different kinds of plan designs and contribution setups, funding policies, all those kinds of things. And so we have that perspective as well. But happy to be here today and look forward to working with all of you more in the future. And so going into the valuation, we'll let Andy go through most of the valuation, but just to set it up here, I'm sure you're all familiar with this before, but within the report, we'll be presenting directly from the report for some familiarity with the report. Starting on page 7, there's the valuation highlights. If you want a 5 to 10 minute read of all the important things that's happened in the valuation, you look at page 7 to 9, 7 to 10, all of the good information is in there. So we'll go into a little bit of details of what we put into page 7, looking at some of the exhibits, but I highly recommend being familiar with page 7 to 9 or so, because that's really what tells the story of what's happened between last year to this year in terms of funded status, in terms of unfunded liability and what's happened on the unfunded liability, in terms of contribution rates, why contribution rates are changing, and then in terms of even what's happened on the asset side of the page and reconciling what's happened there. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn it back over to Andy to go through some of the results.
Great, thank you, Todd. So like Todd indicated, I'm going to start off on page 7 of the report. 2 of the decisions actually the board has made even before we embark on the journey to provide the valuation results are captured on the first 2 paragraphs. Some of the board members may remember that in November of last year, you decided that it's time to actually make some changes to the way the reserves, the assets of the plan are maintained, at least on your financial statements. They used to be done on the book value basis, and actually you would be the last system that are still doing things on the book value. It's neither good nor bad, it's just that those reserves have been maintained on a book value basis. So what the board has decided to do is to line up those reserves so that the book value would become the actuarial value, and the actuarial value, as you can imagine, is key for the actuaries because those are the assets values that we use in the valuation. Now, as part of reviewing that, I think Star pointed out to you that there has been a reserve called the contingency reserve that has been sitting on the financial statement. When asked by some of the board members, our answer was, well, it's not really doing anything productive, let's say, for the retirement system, other than the fact that there's a contingency reserve out there that can be put into better use. So the board decided to transfer the $6 million of the contingency reserve and apply that to reduce the employer's contribution rate requirement. Because as the board, they remember, right now, if there are good times when investments earn more than the assumed rate, or bad times when investments come in less than the assumed rate, it's really the employer's responsibility to either enjoy the better than expected return or less than expected return, or suffer from the less than expected return. In any event, the board made the decision to actually apply the $6 million and provide relief to the employer's contribution rate. So later on, when we go through the page, you will see where the $6 million comes into play is actually enhance the investment return for the year a little bit. The other decision that was in relation to the interest crediting policy was that there is a interest crediting rate for the members' contribution account that the board has to set each and every year. So for most systems, you can either set it at a low interest rate, such as 5-year treasury, for example, or you can set it equal to the assumed rate of return for the valuation, which is 6.5%. So the board decided to set it at 2.5%, and the rationale being that really we are here to serve our members who are expected to retire from the plan. We all love all our members, right? So even those members who withdraw their contributions are the members that we're looking after. But for those members, really their intention is not to have the members use our reserve or use our information in the system like a passbook or investment vehicle. So for that reason, investment return for the members who are expected to terminate from the plan is going to be set from now on at 2.5%. So for the members who retire from the plan, whatever is in the member's account is really not that important, because at the end of the day, it's the pension, is the lifetime pension, and the continuance that would go to his or her spouse that matters. So, and again, it is saving the system a little bit of money, because for those members who are expected to terminate, withdraw his or her account, we're going to be saving not a lot of money, but after all, it's still about $1.5 million on the present value basis. So those are the two changes. Again, taking the reserve and making that a book value, from the book value to a smooth actuarial value, applying the interest crediting, the contingency reserve, and use that immediately to reduce the employer's contribution rate. But last but not least, we reduce the liability a little bit, because the withdrawal of the contribution is not going to be worth as much to the member. Okay? So in a summary, that's what would happen before we even embark on the process of performing this year's valuation. So now I'm finally able to go through the highlights of the valuation with you. When you look at the funded status of the plan, you can look at it in one of two ways. You can express the assets in terms of the liability and call that the funding ratio, or you can take the difference between the two. You take the liability, you subtract the assets, and the difference is called the UAAL. So either the funding status of ratio, or you look at the absolute difference in the dollar amount. Either way will allow us to see on a relative term, especially when you compare the funding status over a period of time, such as 10 years, whether or not the plan is on the right trajectory in terms of funding the liability that becomes due in the future. So I think I now would like to ask Robert to help me turn to page 40 of the report. Oh, I'm sorry.
Judy's actually going to run that for us.
Okay, Judy. Maybe we'll turn to page 39 first, so where we can actually, this is a good page too. So on this page, you will see how the funding status of the plan has changed from 72.4%, so I'm looking at the third column from the right, to the 74% this year. So this is the ratio that I was talking about. If you see the absolute dollar amounts and see how the unfunded actuarial accrued liability has changed from last year to this year, we're now looking at the fourth column from the right. Looking at the last two rows, you can see that the unfunded liability of the plan has come down from about $255 million to $248 million. So both are going in the right direction. At the end of the day, once all the liabilities have been paid off, we would like the funding ratio to approach 100%. So we're marching and making at least incremental progress doing that. And the unfunded liability, we want that to become zero at the end of the amortization policy. So again, it's going in the right direction. But the question can still be raised by the board. So what actually happened? Why do we still have $248 million in unfunded liability? And how does this actually compare based on the assumptions that we have used in the valuation to measure things such as, well, when members retire from the plan, and are we earning the assumed rate of return of 6.5%? So with that, I will now ask Judy to help me turn back to page 30 of the report. So where we have a reconciliation of the unfunded liability from last year to this year. Now, I'm not going to go through all the line items, but sufficient to say that if all the assumptions were to be met, the amount of the unfunded liability that we start off with at the beginning of the year of $255 million, so that's line item number 1, would actually come down to $249 million. So what happened is, as the employer as well as the members make the contributions, not only would they make enough contributions to pay off the normal cost for the year, but there would be some amount left over to pay off some of the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And again, if all the actuarial assumptions of the plan were to come true, the amount of the UAAL of the plan would have come down from $255 million to the $246 million at the end of this year. So this is the line item number 5. But not all the actuarial assumptions actually come true. Now I'm going to go through the line item 6 with you very closely. So in this case, anything that is include in the bracket is a reduction, is a gain. So we like that, at least from the plan's perspective. So for example, if we look at the investment return for the year, on the market value basis, the fund did actually very well. The rate of return on the market value basis was about 9.25%. However, we don't use market value of assets in the valuation. So imagine that if we set the market value, use the market value to set the employer's contribution rate, and I've said early on, the employer is responsible for paying off the UAL, and in good or bad times, they will be charged the UAL rate. So if we set the employer's contribution using market value of assets, this year it would be quite favorable because the rate of return was 9.27%. However, there were years where the rate of return actually would have come in lower than what we would expected, like 6.5%. So we know that we at least know enough about municipal finance to know that, well, if we set a contribution rate which fluctuates dramatically from one year to the other, it's going to do a lot of damage to the county's budget. So for that reason, the board has implemented a so-called 5-year assets moving method. So what that method entails is, if you have a year, let's say 16.5% is the rate of return, you don't recognize the 16.5% in 1 year, but rather you recognize 1/5 of the favorable return each and every year. So in this hypothetical example, if the actual rate of return were to come in at 16.5%, you would take 10%, which you earn more than the assumed rate, and spread it out over a period of 5 years. So instead of having a rate of return of 16.25 followed by 6.5, 6.5, now you would have 5 years of superior return. 5 years at 8.5, 8.5, 8.5, 8.5 for 5 years, followed by 6.5%. So in other words, we are still recognizing the favorable return, but we are recognizing that incremental. And it goes the other way. If the rate of return were to come in lower than expected, we would do exactly the opposite. So in this case, after going through the thing that I was talking about, and there's a page in the report which we will go to in the next few minutes, the return for the year was 8.5%, 8.05%. So it created a return relative to the assumed rate of 6.5%. The favorable return was in the tunes of $10 million. But if you ask me, okay, well, was that really all due to this smoothing method that I was talking about? The answer is no, because remember I said early on, the board made a decision to take the contingency reserve of the plan and uses that to reduce the employer's contribution rate. So incorporated in the $10.3 million is actually about $6 million due to the use of that contingency reserve to reduce the employer's contribution. So net, if we just take out the $6 million that was transferred from the contingency reserve, the return was still over the assumed rate because it was very close to 7%. So 7% is the return if we don't count the contingency reserve, but because we count the contingency reserve, now the return is 8%, and the favorable investment experience was a reduction in the unfunded liability by $10 million. So the other item that on this page are items that you see all the time. So for example, on item 6B, there's a 1 year lag between the date when the board sets the contribution rate and when the contribution rate in the valuation report is being adopted. So take, for example, today, even after the board approves our contribution rate recommended in the 2024 valuation, they would not be implemented by the employer until 25-26 fiscal year. So for that reason, if the contribution rates are actually going down, you can argue that, well, we're collecting a little bit more than we would have to. If the contribution rate are going down because the employer is still paying the higher rate that was set in the valuation from a year before. So it goes the other way. If the contribution rates are going up, you would not be collecting enough contributions, not until the following year. And that's exactly what happened during the 2023-24 year. Contribution rate in the 2023 val was going up, but we were not collecting the amount, not until the fiscal year we are currently in right now, not the 23-24. So that's why there's a small actuarial loss of $3 million. The other item has to do with item C, is very much related, has to do with, well, but when the contribution rate I apply to the payroll, is that applied to a payroll as expected by the actuary, or is that actually applied to a payroll which is lower than what we expected? Now, in this case, for the 23-24 year, we expect the payroll in the last valuation to grow at 3%, but that did not happen for two reasons. There's actually a reduction in the number of active employees working for the county, and presumably even on the employees who are actively working for the county, their payroll, when you add them all up, is less than what we expected. So two reasons which gave rise to the contribution rate being applied to payroll, which is lower than what we expected because of headcounts. Active headcounts are not as many as what we expected, and the salaries for those active employees who work for the employer is not coming in as much as what we have expected. So we have a small contribution loss due to payroll coming in less than expected of about $2 million. Now the next item is on how much salary increases our individual active employees are getting relative to the assumptions. Now, I said earlier on that a negative means a reduction in liability. So from the plan's perspective, it's good for the plan because the liabilities are coming in lower than expected, but of course it's not great for the employees. Employees deserve the salary increases, but they're not getting the ones, at least in the short term, based on the assumptions that are predicted by the actuaries. So for this year, it is a gain for the plan, and I look at the report from last year. Last year, it was going the opposite direction, so which means that the employees are getting salary increases slightly more than what we expected. So we would expect in some years they're higher, some years they're lower. So it would hopefully would watch out in the long term. But this year, it's good for the plan because the liability is coming down by about $5.7 billion. Similarly, there's a assumption that we have to put into the valuation to anticipate cost of living adjustments that our members who are entitled to that COLA will get. So our current assumption for those tiers that are entitled to COLA is 2.75%. For 2024, the COLA coming in is about 3. I think the actual change in the CPI was about 3.5%. So it was coming in definitely higher than what we had expected. So again, this is one of those assumptions that is great for the plan. It's not good for the plan because the COLA is coming in higher than what we expect, but it's certainly good for the retirees because relative to the assumptions that we have used in the valuation, it's coming in higher. The retirees are finally rewarded 3% to help them compensate for the loss in the purchasing power. Now, one item, I apologize when I said these items are items that you have seen in the past. Everything is true with the exception of this item coming up. This has to do with some data updates for reciprocal vested members. I remember, I think when Paul, Angelo, and myself were setting actuarial assumptions for the board, I think in 2020, before the 2023 valuation, we were particularly focused on what happened to members who left Mendocino County. Where did they go? So it was pointed out to us that a lot of those members actually moved across the county to Sonoma, for example. So a lot of those members, when they move over, we have already been informed by staff that, well, they're going to get a salary increase not based on a salary that would be used to calculate the benefit, not based on the benefit, or not based on the salary that they earn at Mendocino, but rather, for example, in this case, at Sonoma County. So the question is, well, have you taken into account that perhaps because of the change in the geography, that the salary increases might be higher than what you have expected by the assumption? So sure enough, when staff actually ask the other county, I just used Sonoma as an example, but when they ask the other counties, well, for these members who are working now with you at your county, what kind of salary are they getting from the county? So sure enough, when they were plugged into the valuation process, the liabilities are coming in higher relative to what we have expected. And also in the process of doing that, we were informed that there were about 92 members. What happened is, in years past, we thought that those members actually quit the county and just maybe work for a private employer. But that was not the case. So these employees actually went to work for a reciprocal employer. So they would be treated very similar to the example, that hypothetical example that I was pointing out early on. When they retire from those other county retirement systems that have reciprocity with Mendocino, they are going to get their pension benefit calculated using the salary at those last counties that they work. So when we add them, when we were given that information together with those individuals whose salaries that were reported to us by some of our sister county retirement systems, it actually increased the liability by $12 million. So you could argue that, well, maybe we should not have asked the other county retirement systems, right? Then we don't have to put the $12 million on your valuation. But the reality, of course, is we'll find out one way or the other. I think it's we should definitely thank our staff for reaching out, because you would rather find out about those rather hidden liabilities sooner rather than later, so that we can reflect that in the valuation. So if you now add up all the different events, and the total change in the liability is a increase of $2 million. So there are a lot of things going on. You can say that investment is very favorable, but definitely we have to make some adjustments in the data that actually gave back the investment gains plus some. So that's what happened during the 2024 year as far as the change in UAAL.
We have a question from Trustee Crum.
Thank you, Andy. And with subsection F, I believe we did talk about anticipating reaching out to these other agencies? It's always been our assumption that when somebody leaves employment in Mendocino County and continues to work in government or a defined pension system, that it's probably for a pay raise. If not, they're relocating. But this confirmed that belief that they're obviously leaving to make more money.
That's
And we've never calculated that amount before, correct? Before this study today?
Yeah, we never got the information from the other county that instead of getting a pay raise, which according to the actuary is only about 4% each year, now it may be coming in, for example, hypothetically, maybe 10%. So that's the new thing that we're finding out by asking or surveying the other county.
And it doesn't have to be county. They could be going to city government or
Exactly.
anywhere else, any
That's
other type of defined pension system that's
That's
at
right.
governments. Okay. And it's our plan to continue doing that, so we have a more realistic understanding of the liability to our plan, correct?
Yeah, I think as a matter of fact, if the actuary has a say in the administration, we would insist that you do that. So that way, we'll find out immediately, as opposed to making a wholesale, let's say, adjustment for almost 100 of our members. We'll be making some incremental changes each and every year. I think that's something that we would like to do from now on.
So my question is, 92 members surprised me a little bit. I know people leave, especially in my line of work, to go to neighboring counties and make more money, but is it our anticipation that that number will continue to be that high, or is that because we were just doing it for the first time with the deferred members that we thought may not be working anywhere?
The deferred member number is unusually large since we did the inactive interest correction as part of the VCP application. So there were a number of accounts that were reopened and really only are just the members' omitted interest that we owe them. So not all of those, matter of fact, the majority of those accounts listed as deferred inactive are not actually eligible for a benefit. As far as current members leaving, we do see those with reciprocity or who have more than 5 years typically selecting a deferred retirement with us. I don't know if that answered your question in full.
A little bit. I've always thought that our deferred numbers on our monthly report were high, and it sounds like you agree with that.
Yes.
My underlying question is the 92, is that for just the fiscal year that you're doing this valuation, or is that to catch up because we've never done this part of that evaluation before?
Yeah, I think it's a catching up to include
realize all those deferred members that had left and have
That's right.
gained employment somewhere else in the system.
One thing we did in the past year or so was ask deferred members with reciprocity, outgoing reciprocity, to update their salary information with us at their new reciprocal agency. And the impact of that is shown here in this report, and that is new. We have not made a concerted effort in many, many years to get updated salary information. So the cost of those deferred benefits is now more accurate because we have more current salary information on some of them, but not all of them.
And I know there's a lot of assumptions in all these questions, but at the end of the day, my anticipation would be for the next valuation that we have that it hopefully won't be that high of a number that we're assuming additional liability on because we caught it up. But it would just be for that fiscal year of new deferred members that have reciprocity in another system.
Well, if we continue to get updated reciprocal salary information from our members, let's say we had roughly 300, I don't know, what's the total number with?
387 for this.
That's
one.
deferred.
Yeah, correct.
But not all of those have reciprocity.
Nope.
I don't recall the total with reciprocity, but we did not get updated salary information on all of them. I want to say it was it less than 1/3, Judy, that responded with updated salary information? So if we got updated salary information on the other 2/3, again, you could see an increase in the liability associated with the deferred status members because we would be using a more accurate salary number to estimate the liability of that future benefit.
But again, our assumption is of the 387, not all of those in reciprocal systems. So
correct. I don't have the number in front of me of how many actually have outgoing reciprocity.
got it. Thank you.
Can I just confirm that the total impact by payroll, so from item B through E, was really only like a net of $18,000, close to 18,000? Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, in total, it's very small, very,
Okay,
yeah,
so it does all net out together.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. So that's why at the end of the day, it's really the investment, which is very favorable, offset by, I would say maybe data adjustment, data correction of $12 million. So that's why the bottom line is about $2 million.
If I can just add one observation to this page, we start at the beginning at 255, and we end, even with the $2 million loss, the total is 248. So even despite the fact that we had losses in this year from our experience, we're deep now in our amortization policy and in that funding policy that we've been working on for years to work through those old amortization layers, especially that original restart layer that we're working through. So we're finally in strong positive amortization there, and that's showing up here. So despite the fact that we have a $2 million loss, we're still seeing the unfunded liability march steadily downward, as Andy mentioned earlier. So that's still, despite the loss, of favorable result for our plan as we continue to work through that amortization of the current layers.
And if I may, we did make a decision numerous years ago to eliminate a few years off of that restart layer.
That's right.
Which obviously will benefit the system and the county plan sponsor to pay it off earlier with less interest.
That's right.
And I think we're somewhere in the 16 to 17 year frame, if I'm right.
It's 12.
Yeah.
Are we 12?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's down to 12, yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Okay, so that's the reconciliation of the unfunded liability. So I will speed up and go to page 33, please, Judy. So page 33, we take the employer's contribution rate, and even though there's no single employer paying the rate of 40.07%, but because the county is such a dominant employer in the plan, more or less, the county's contribution is about 40% of pay, about $35 million, using this payroll estimate that we have determined in this valuation. Now, if the contribution rate, they are set based on general, they're set based on safety and probation, there's different contribution rate for members for each and every tier. If all these contribution rates were to be approved by the board today, the employer's rate more or less would become 41.29% of payroll, about $36 million. Now, all the line items that I've been talking about on the UAAL are represented on this page. Now, the only line item that you will not see on the other page is line item number F. So early on, when Sarah asked the question, are all the contributions, the salaries, are they all netting out to be about net zero? The answer is yes. However, in this case, because the employer's payroll, the headcount and the payroll are not coming in as we have expected. We expect the payroll to grow at the assumed rate of 3%, and that's very important because later on when we look at the page in the report that talks about how the unfunded liabilities are paid off, the payments each year are scheduled to increase at the assumed rate of pay increases, which currently is set at 3%. So what that means is that in years such as the year we're in right now, because of headcount not coming in as many as last valuation, and because the payroll in total is not coming in, growing at the rate of 3%, we are effectively taking the amount of unfunded liability. As Todd rightly pointed out, we are paying off the UAL. The UAL is coming down. But even though the UAL is coming down, there's a payment. The payment is expected to grow at the annual rate of 3% each year. So to the extent that years such as this, where the total payroll is not growing at 3%, then the employer's rate will have to go up in order to get the same dollar contributions that we would expect to pay off the UAL. So, and that's exactly what is going on in line item number F. So it looks like, well, payroll is we're missing the payroll estimate by maybe about 5%, but yet the impact on the UAL on the rate is actually quite significant. It's 1.45% of payroll, and it's all as a function of payroll growth not being met in the valuation. So again, on the UAL side, it is relatively no big deal to have contributions not collected on the right payroll because we got that back by active member salary not coming in as high as what we expected. But in this case, for the rate setting process, if we don't have payroll growing at the assumed rate of 3%, then there would have to be a higher contribution rate that we would have to charge employees.
So my question is, moving forward, I understand the last year we did not have payroll growth at the anticipated rate of 3%. is that realistic for the upcoming year? Are we going to continue to anticipate payroll to grow at 3%? And is that realistic with the county's expectation that it will grow at 3%? Or will we have this continued issue of an unrealistic anticipation of it growing at 3%?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to give you a satisfactory answer because it depends.
Well, I'm asking you to predict the future, and that's not fair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, although I can see, I can actually walk the board through what has happened in the past. So maybe Judy, if you would help me turn to page 18. Page 18. So I'm looking at the number of active members. So on this table, the second column from the left. So what happened is this only has active headcount for the employers, of course, including the county, the most dominant employer for the past 10 years. So you can see that for the maybe for the first 8 of those years, the number of active employees actually was on an increasing trend. So everything was going fine, payroll was going in the right direction, but then it took a little bit of a small dive in year 2022, and then it picked back up at 1,150, and only to see the active headcount drop by about 3 to 4% in the current year. So it appears that the number of positions, either the county has difficulty hiring enough members to place them in the right position, or maybe they were just having some budgetary issues.
I think they're freezing numerous positions. So that's where my question goes back to, are we going to continue to have that anticipated rate of 3% growth in payroll if we have information that the county is going to freeze positions, and is that realistic? So is your expectation to continue having the 3% growth anticipated in payroll?
That's what we have expected in the valuation. Now, as a matter of fact, we would not be looking at that assumption until the next experience study. So the board may remember we look at that as part of the 23 evaluation, 24. So we would apply at least a 3% assumption unless instructed otherwise by the board for another year.
Okay.
So
That's correct. The 3% growth assumption was based on our last experience study that is then used for the following 3 years, and they would continue to use that for the 3-year period until it's re-reviewed unless they receive some other direction from our board.
If I may add one thing that's interesting about this is if you go back to 2015, 10 years before, 1107, exact same number we have in the current valuation. And our 3% assumption does not assume that we're adding new headcount. It actually assumes a stable headcount. But the challenge is that headcount went up, and then it came back down. So we're in the downward part of that to get back to that same starting number, and we're feeling that right.
But if you go over 2 columns, the inactive number is what glares to me when you compare it to 2015. It's more than double. So that's proof and evidence that people are bailing for better paying jobs, likely in neighboring counties. It's one element of it.
309 of those were added back in as part of that inactive interest account. So if we knock off 300, we would be right around 600, up from, let's say, 577 back in 2021. So this table certainly illustrates that point that I brought up about the inactive interest accounts that we had to reopen because they were omitted and owed some interest. We have seen actuarial gains and primarily actuarial losses due to salary changes being not what we expected. So there's a salary assumption change for individual members in addition to an overall growth of payroll that plays into the valuation there.
Thank you.
And when we look at it in the next experience study, of course, it'll be something we'll keep in mind for exactly the same reason. We assume a 3% payroll growth over time, and we build that into the contributions that we anticipate. If payroll was going to be flat long-term, for example, and if we put that in the valuation, that would be called a level dollar amortization instead of level percentage pay going up. Level dollar amortization all of a sudden flattens the curve, which means my hand here, the early years, it gets higher. You got to pay more contributions early in order to continue to fund. So it is actually a painful process to go to, say, a level dollar amortization compared to level percentage of pay. We do have some counties where certain employers have said, hey, long-term, we're not hiring, we're going to be declining in our payroll, and we have moved them to that method. But that's a pretty strong change. So we do that with some consideration ahead of time.
So historically, if, so going back to page 33, if the effect of the smaller than expected payroll is about $1.3 million, historically, if this has happened, would we require the plan sponsor, the county, to then make payments towards that in some kind of agreement?
It becomes part of the
Just the contribution?
experience for that year's actuarial gains and losses that is then amortized over an 18-year period. And of course, the actuaries can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but that's how it gets paid. Is the cost is essentially shared among all three of our plan sponsors. It's just that like 96% of that cost is the county's. So it's amortized and paid over 18 years.
Okay, so it's not like an additional payment per year?
It could be, and so that is something that we track for all the plan sponsors for each 1-year period. You know, and I've reached out to all the plan sponsors every time, multiple years when need be. This is the first time that I've seen this year that this is likely going to, I guess I shouldn't say it that way, but it's possible this year that there's additional contributions that will be needed.
And to add to what Robert just said, we have a funding policy that requires our plan sponsors to pay the minimum dollar amount as calculated by Siegel, which then is converted to a percent of payroll. So if the percent of payroll that actually occurs during the year ends up being less than the specified dollar amount, we reach back out to the plan sponsors to make up that shortfall. That's separate than the amortization of a gain or loss that is amortized over 18 years. So part of it is our funding policy, and part of it is the amortization.
Do we have that calculated amount now?
For this fiscal year, regarding the contributions, as far as where we stand, if we expect the county to make the current year's required contribution on a dollar value? Yes, and Robert's been in contact with Tony.
Oh, okay.
So now going back to the valuation, we look at the reconciliation on the employer's rate on page 33. On page 34, Judy, if you would please turn to page 34. We have a similar, again, reconciliation for the employee's rate. As I've indicated earlier on, we don't have a member who's actually paying the exact same average rate of 10.47% last year, nor the 10.32% this year. However, the one thing that, of course, the board members observe, they have a lot fewer items. There's only one item on here. This has to do with the change in the membership demographics. For example, when the member enters the plan, are they entering at an older or a younger entry age? That's what this number is all about. The reason why there are so few items, there's only one on this sheet this year, has to do with the fact that anytime where there's any deviation, for example, investment return coming in better than expected, or we have to make some adjustments in the data for some of our deferred vested members, it's always the employer, the county, and the other two sponsoring employer who will have to either increase or decrease the contribution rate. So this is done by statute. So under the 37 Act, I'm looking at Jeff as I make this statement because I'm not a lawyer. The employer is responsible for any actuarial gains and losses. So that's why in this case, there's only one item. There might be two items if we change the actuarial assumptions, but because we are not changing the assumptions, so that's why there's only one line item. Now, I know that there's a lot, rightfully so, of interest on the amortization schedule, so let's turn to page 77. Page 77 is where we will see how the unfunded liability of the plan, which is about $248 million for all the general safety and the probation membership categories combined, are all added up together. You can see at the bottom of the page, it's $248 million. The $26 million is the UAL contribution. So if we go back to the earlier page, which we are not going to look at the contribution rate for the employees made up of the normal cost and the UAL. So a very significant amount of the employer's contribution is towards paying off the UAL, and that payment for this year is $26 million. Now, it could be well observed that if you look at the $248 million and actually see all the different layers, so this is almost like our mortgages, right? Instead of having one or two mortgages, we have multiple mortgages. Every time we have any deviance of actuarial assumptions, we set up a new layer. So this year, the new layer that we set up was the new UAAL that we were looking at a few minutes ago of $2.3 million. So that's the new layer, and the payment is $169,000. But if you look at all the past layers, of course, the one layer that jumps right out at you is the $122 million. But that's also the layer that the board has several years ago decided to shorten the amortization period a little bit, and now it's coming down to $12 million. So besides the very hefty original combined layer of 222, the other ones that are very significant has to do with the change in the actuarial assumptions. So your board has a policy to look at the assumptions every 3 years. So in the most recent evaluation for an experience study, I'm looking at the second line from the bottom. We recommend, and the board approved our recommendation to reduce the investment return assumption from 6.75 to 6.5. So that adds about $18 million of the unfunded liability. So now if we go back successively in time to the 2020, the $14 million, the 2017 experience study 24, and also the 2014 experience study of $42 million, they all added up together to equal to about $100 million. So if I take the $100 million unfunded liability created, because we do the right thing, right? We remeasure the liability using the right assumptions, more realistic actuarial assumption. We combine that with the outstanding base. That's really more or less equal to the total unfunded liability we have in the plan today. The total is about $222 million versus $248 million. So I think an observation can be made is that every year there's going to be some assumptions that would not be met either on the positive side or negative side. But at the end of the day, if you look at this schedule for the last 12 years, the misses actually is not that significant. Of course, 20 million plus is still a lot of money. But relatively speaking, most of the changes are really recommendations made by your actuary that the board approved after going through the necessary deliberations to make sure that you have more realistic actuarial assumptions that we use in the valuation. So that's the only point I want to make. And then, of course, on page 78, is where you will see how the unfunded liability will trend down over time. So it goes without saying that the elephant in the room is that combined base of $120+ million. So it's going to take another long 12 years, but sure enough, 12 years later, it will be fully paid off. And the payment on page 79 will actually drop off by quite a bit. By the time the last of the UAAL payment for that combined base is paid off, you'll see the red totally disappear from the page. And again, the reason why this is the sum of all the payments. The reason why the payments will not remain flat, remember I said early on, the contribution rates for the UAAL have been calculated, assuming that they will grow at the assumed rate of 3% each year. So if you superimpose the payments over the payroll and assuming the payroll will grow at 3%, if you take one divided by the other, it will stay as a level percent of the payroll. But in terms of the dollar amount, the dollar amounts will grow at the rate of 3%. But sure enough, in year 2036, when the last of the 12-year payment of the outstanding balance of the combined base is going to be paid off, you will see a dramatic reduction in UAL payment.
So it's been a few years, and I believe Trustee Shoemaker brought it up. I'm sorry, Trustee Schappmeyer brought it up about the pension obligation bonds that would drop off of the county in the next few years. And is there any anticipation or ambition to give recommendations to the county to take that funding and apply it to the UAL to pay it off earlier with less interest? Or is that not related to this topic enough to talk about?
I'm not prepared to answer that, quite honestly, today. I know the county recently had received more financial reporting that was much more complete, and they have a better idea of where their finances stand, which is a good thing. But I have not had any contact with the executive office about conversations regarding the funding that would be available once they no longer have to fund the pension obligation bonds. I don't know if they already have that earmarked for other requirements. You know, there's always a lot of need in the county, and I know that there might be interest with the reserves they have with the funding that might become available from the POB to perhaps look at this, but I haven't engaged in any conversations with them.
I think it was a point of conversation some years ago when we were looking at recommendations to make to the county to try to limit the interest paying, and that's where the 2-year reduction in.
Correct. That was one of the items we did discuss with the executive office, and we eventually went forward with a recommendation to reduce the outstanding term on the amortization, the remaining amortization period, which they were agreeable to, and we did see a 3-year reduction in the amortization of that base layer, which does save them money over time. Certainly several $1 million over just a relatively short period regarding that, because it will be paid off 2 or 3 years earlier.
And for full clarity, the UAL is the plan sponsor's responsibility.
Correct.
It doesn't fall on the members, it doesn't fall on anybody else, it falls on the plan sponsor. So the only thing we could do is make a recommendation to the executive office or the board of supervisors that this could result in paying that off faster, which would save millions of dollars in interest theoretically.
Yes, that's correct. I would like to point out just regarding the table on page 77, as Andy pointed out, where you see those significant jumps, it's in the years in which we changed our actuarial assumptions, because over the past decade, we've implemented a number of mortality improvements in addition to reducing the assumed rate of return on the plan. I would say that at this point, really the heavy lifting has been done, and we don't expect to see those types of actuarial changes going forward over the following decade. So actuarial changes would result, I would expect, in smaller increases than they had in the past, because we've moved to a generational benefit-weighted mortality type assumptions, and we've already reduced the assumed rate of return as low as I would expect to go at this point. So I think the worst of what we would expect has probably already been absorbed. And now it's just how we can work with the county to make it affordable and that they can pay it off perhaps in a faster method. If I'm incorrect on anything there, please correct me.
Well said.
But at the end of the day, the recommendation from Siegel would be to increase the contribution rate by the employer by 1.22%.
That's the recommendation in this report, I believe, correct? It goes from 40-something to 41-something.
41 point.
At least the aggregate.
Correct, okay.
Now, speaking about recommendation, there's only one other page that I'd like to take the board to. It's on page 23, where we show the assets, because there's actually a recommendation that we have included in section 1. So before I provide the recommendation, let's go through this page very quickly. So this actually goes through the smooth actuarial value of assets that I was talking about earlier on. So because we don't use market value of assets to set the employer's contribution rate to the UAL. So the way to read this table is, for example, market value is on line 1, 750 million. So for the last 5 years, we have been or 4 years, we've been keeping track the years where the actual return in the second column from the left is coming in at, for example, in year 2021, you can see actual return to 166 million. For that year, there was an exceptional year because the expected return was only, in air quotes, of course, $36 million. So we out-earned the assumed earnings by about 130 million. So to the point that I made early on, we recognize 20% of that each year. So with the end outcome that 2021 was 4 years behind us right now, so that's why as of the date of this valuation, we only have 20% of that gain that needs to be recognized, and it will be done in the next valuation, 26 billion. So you will see the gains and the losses being recognized in each of the next 4 years. So let's look at 2024 as an example. I said early on, 2024 was a good year. Rate of return was over 9% after we take into account the 6%, $6 million in contingency reserve. So the actual return for that year, 61 million. We only expect the plan to earn about 42. So the difference is 18. We recognize 20% and therefore deferring 80% to be recognized in the next 4 years. Now, if you add up all of these amounts, the total is actually relatively small. It's only about 145,000. It's as a result of some good years and some bad years. Bad years, in particular 2022, of 45 million. So if you ask Siegel, okay, how are we going to be recognizing the 145,000 in the next 4 years? The answer is at the bottom of this page. It's very non-level. That's the thing that we want to talk to the board about, and it's one of our recommendations. Because if we just follow the schedule, you will see that for the next valuation, we're going to be recognizing $8.6 million gain, followed by a loss of $17.4 million. That really has to do with the very substantial loss from 2022 that we're going to recognize, but without the benefit of the offset from the 2021. So 25 will be a gain of 8, followed by a loss of 17, followed by a gain of 5, followed by a gain of 3, when the total of all the gains and losses are recognized is equal to 145. So this is something that we have recommended to the board back in, I think, 2019. So rather than to use these very non-level gains and losses in setting the employer's contribution rate for the next 4 years, part of our recommendation in this valuation is to recommend to the board that we would rather recommend to the board that you take the $145,000, the same amount of gains that you would have to recognize anyway, but recognize that in 4 level payments. So the only thing that you have to do is to take the 145 divided by 4, so you get more or less about $40,000 each year. So that is how the gains will be recognized, as opposed to going through and looking at the pattern that is at the footnote of this page. A gain of 8 followed by a loss of 17, which you can argue that, well, it doesn't make any sense. Because after all, we're just trying to recognize a very small gain of 145,000. Now, if the board decides to follow Seago's recommendation, it is not going to change any of the results in this report, because after all, these amounts will only be utilized not just by Seago, but by your staff in the interest crediting calculation for the upcoming year. So it is the fiscal year starting 24-25. So it's nothing to do with changing any of the results. And the beauty about this is it doesn't actually increase or decrease the amount of gains and losses to be recognized on investment. All we're trying to do is recommending to the board is that you just take the amount and recognize that in a level fashion. So that would be our recommendation to the board, in addition to all the contribution rates for the employer and the employee that are developed for each of the 3 membership groups, general safety and probation, and also by tier. So I think unless the board has any questions, I think this at least concluded remarks on rate.
Yeah, just one additional thing on the asset, we call it asset re-smoothing, this recommendation that Andy just talked about. And the only time that we recommend this is when the actuarial value and the market value are basically on top of it. They're basically the same number. If you look at number 6 on this page, the ratio of actuarial value to market value, 5 divided by 1, you get 100.0%. They're almost identical. If there was one that was quite a bit different than the other, then we just want to let the smoothing happen as is and not tinker with the results, not look like we're trying to manipulate the results. But right here, there's no manipulation going on. They're right on top of it. And that's one of the reasons why it's.
I just want to make sure my understanding is correct. By re-smoothing and recognizing the $145,000 over the following 4 years instead of $8.6 million gain, then a $17 million loss. The result is that it just helps smooth out that employer contribution rate, so there's not a large swing by recognizing an $8.6 million gain and then the next year having to recognize that $17 million loss. So ultimately, in the end of 4 years, you've recognized the same dollar values. It's just that we're going to net them and make a smoother transition on the employer contribution rate. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly the recommendation.
I understand that. I guess I'm still somewhat confused on the transfer assets between the certain membership groups. I don't understand how that impacts that.
Oh, okay. Now, the transfer of assets is actually another new process that we want to implement, and it's actually we have taken the step to implement that. This has to do with in the course of collecting membership data for 23-24, we observed that there were 6 members who've actually moved up, work at the county and move among the general safety and probation classification. Now, that's not to say that those transfers have not taken place in the past, but what has caught our attention is a lot of these members are actually moving into the probation category. So if we don't move the assets, so right now when Robert provides us with the so-called reserve for the valuation, he actually tells us, well, here are the assets that have been set aside to provide for the probation members when they retire. So the county will do what the county does. They hire employees. They allow the members to transfer from one membership category to the other. Now, if we have not done anything in the valuation, will be fully reflecting all the liability associated with these members' probation who have just transferred from the general. So instead of counting the liability based on the benefits that the member has earned starting as a probation member, we'll be counting all the benefits, including the ones from the general and safety. And we think that that's not fair for the probation, because after all, these members have been working for general in the general department and putting in the members' contribution and employee contribution. So all we are trying to do is to make sure that whenever a member moves from one membership category to the other, the assets move along with the member. So that way, when we do the valuation and we look at the liability and we ask ourselves, how come they're so high? It's because the member has previous service with another county general department. But now the assets arrive at the same time, they offset each other. And so really at the end of the day, we're just charging the probation department for the cost to provide for the benefit due to that probation employment as opposed to all the past general or maybe.
So it's an adjustment to realize the movement of employees within the county.
That's right.
And has no impact over those membership group contribution rates whatsoever.
This would be as little impact as possible. Absolutely. That's the idea.
Okay.
But ultimately, there is an impact because the rates are different between each group, correct?
Yes.
Their future service is going to accrue at the new
different
benefit
rates.
formula, and there's the different rates for safety, probation, and general for those groups for the current service they're accruing. Ultimately, when they retire, the years of service they accrued as a general member, let's say, are calculated at the general formula, and only
Okay.
those years in the probation category, for example, would be at that formula. I don't think it would have a significant impact on any of the rate that you're referring to. And I again apologize. Please correct me.
Yeah, I think as a matter of fact, I agree with Doris. If we look at this holistically for the county, because the county is the employer, 96% of the payroll, I think if the county is looking at all the departments' budget and everything together, they would say, well, they're really indifferent. So the only difference is once an employee, especially those who are going from a general to a probation classification, the benefit is better, right? So better benefit will translate into a higher normal cost rate that needs to be paid by the employer, the county, but that's already happening. Whenever the employee moves over, the classification changes, they're already paying the higher normal cost rate. So all we're trying to do is to make sure that not just the normal cost rate, but the UAL rate stays as, I guess, equitable as possible among the two county departments.
Do we have any board discussion? Are you guys, you're done with your presentation at this point?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I noted on the report 3 instances of the term stochastic projection. I'm not asking for the proprietary projection black box treatment that you're using, but I am interested in what the industry uses for stochastic projections, such as maybe Markov chain Monte Carlo. I mean, I would like a few techniques.
Yeah, it's a Monte Carlo simulation. So what happened is every 3 years, after the board approves the assumptions in the actuarial value in the experience study, we go through an experience study. We go through prepare a so-called risk report where we actually take the membership data, we take the investment information we got from your trusted advisors at Callan, and we put that into the Monte Carlo simulation in order to help us project when, let's be honest, we don't expect the fund to actually earn 6.5% each year. There will be years where the returns are higher, there are years that the returns are lower. So we rely on this so-called Monte Carlo simulation to at least provide the board, well, what looks like to be like the percentile return and how is that going to be translating into contribution rate. So we would expect to do this again maybe about 2 years after the experience study is performed, but the last time it was done, it was part of the risk report.
Thank you.
Microphone is on. Let's start with that. On the issue of reciprocity, and I just wanted to comment, that really comes across to me as something that where we have a situation where another plan sponsor from a totally separate county can grant pay raises that then we're liable for. It seems unfair. And am I just overestimating how unfair that seems? Because it just seems like we would have no control as a board, or the plan sponsor would have no control over these increases.
You're correct. There's not a lot of control that this board has over that because state law dictates the provisions of reciprocity. So as our members go to other counties and secure employment there, or universities, or any other state system that we have a reciprocal agreement with, when they retire, the highest salary between any of the employers in a reciprocal chain is used for calculation of all their benefits as a way to encourage public service, and the board here has no say or control over it because it is dictated by law.
Right. And at this point, we are beginning to track, or we did not previously track how many employees, or obviously we would know who had established reciprocity.
We know who has established reciprocity, both incoming and outgoing. For outgoing reciprocity, we do make attempts to obtain salary information, and recently had done a push to get updated salary information because many of the salaries we had were quite old. Although we didn't successfully get updated salary information from all of our reciprocal members, we did get quite a few updated that did, you saw the impact in this valuation study. It's a common practice with plans to try to get updated reciprocal salary information so they can better cost that benefit, but it is a cost borne by the plan as the law was designed.
And so one final question, and this is actually my real question: how many hops do we track? And is it possible to have multiple hops between this reciprocity and then another?
Yes, they can establish a chain of reciprocal agencies. I start at one jurisdiction, I leave and take employment with another, I leave here and go and take an employment with the state, and so everybody in that chain, and it could be 2, 3, 4, who knows how many reciprocal agencies that get linked, would be using the same final average salary from the highest final comp in whichever jurisdiction it was. It doesn't have to be their last employer, but whatever that highest final average comp is would be used by all the reciprocal systems to calculate the benefit of the member.
Okay, and then one final question. You said that you had not reached everybody and not had been able to get updated salary information on all of the employees who had established reciprocity. Is it possible to apply any kind of statistical analysis on the ones who are missing and anticipate that they would probably be receiving more money? Almost everybody who leaves the county of Mendocino and established reciprocity is doing so to make more money.
Based on the ones where we have at least some sort of salary information, we might be able to apply like an increase inflation factor to it to say over time that we would expect their salary to increase. However, even with a number of individuals who have established outgoing reciprocity, we may have no salary data at all, and we wouldn't really have a starting point to gauge that from. Okay. If we don't have a salary from their reciprocal employer, I believe we're using the current salary they had with us when they left to judge that liability or to value that liability. It's difficult because obviously folks' salary changes regularly throughout their career, and we're not always kept in the loop as far as getting that updated. And even portals where we have access to data, let's say with CalPERS, it doesn't give us that level of data, if I remember correctly. I'm sorry, Andy?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Doris said. I actually clarify one thing. To the extent that we were informed by the system, a lot of members were informed by the system that they left Mendocino to work for a reciprocal agency, we automatically apply the 4% pay increase each year. Okay. So it's already there. I think the The more difficult part is to the extent that our employees were able to get a promotion, for example, working for Sonoma County, that's the salary increase which can usually come in higher than the 4%. That's something that we did not anticipate. The only way for us to capture that would be to get the salary that Doris was.
Thank you for clarifying that. I didn't realize it.
Okay, so you apply a 4% assumed rate of salary, of COLA, so to speak,
Each year,
for
that's
each of the
right.
employees.
That's
And
right.
then there would be, so we would really only need to capture the, as you said, promotions, major promotions.
And then I think I need to give credit where credit is due. As a matter of fact, if you ask Siegel, we are the actually for 12 county retirement systems. How many of those county retirement systems are actually routinely, at least from now on, pull the other retirement system and ask, hey, we've heard so-and-so is now working for you, what's their salary? There are only 2. Used to be only 1, and now I can add that to the list because now we can say Mendocino does. Not very many.
It would seem like we would need to, more than others were smaller, and we seem to be on the short end of the stick. One other item I wanted to talk about, and that was the item of the lower head count that we have here. And there was some talk, and I think that I wasn't sure if the next year we would be planning to base our math on the 1107 head count, or do we apply a 3% on some other number? I think it might have been asked, but in ways that I didn't quite get. Are you following my question?
Yeah.
How do we apply 3% when we don't know exactly how many employees are going to be working the county?
Andy, just to clarify, did you state earlier that, or Todd, I don't remember which of you was speaking, my apologies, that you're assuming a level number of employees, but just assuming the 3% was in the pay?
Yeah, so it's not so much the headcount. We do assume level headcount from one year to the next, but the more important number is the covered payroll going from one year to the next. And that's what we assume the covered payroll will grow by in total. And that includes inflation, plus maybe a little bit of real increases for our members on top of it. Not even as high as the assumption for reciprocal, right, of 4% a year, but there is that assumption.
Okay, do any other trustees have questions, comments?
Well, I'd also like to clarify that is another thing that we're tracking and communicating to all the plan sponsors. That payroll growth, that base growth rate.
Okay.
So there's hopefully fewer surprises.
At this point, I guess I'll call for public comment. Do we have anyone who would like to make a public comment?
There does not appear to be any public comment.
Okay, so I believe we would move on at this point to asking if we have a motion. Would anybody like to make a motion?
It's stated on the agenda under recommended action, if that's helpful.
In addition to the recommended motion as it's written on the agenda, I would like to clarify that the board is also accepting the recommendation from Siegel to re-smooth the deferred gains and losses that are recognized over the following 4 years, and the movement of the reserve for the safety. Is that something they need to adopt, the move for general to probation reserve adjustments?
Not necessarily, because I think while this is the first time we're reporting and doing that, but we expect that in the long run, we would see some members going from one category to the other. So I think as long as the board is comfortable with that process, we would recommend to the board that you give actually some flexibility so that we would do that from now on, and we think that is a better process going forward.
So we would be looking for a motion to approve the June 30, 2024 actuarial study and to adopt the recommended employer and employee contribution rates within the report, including the recommendation on the re-smoothing of the deferred gains and losses.
Okay, is it necessary for the trustee to repeat what you said, or is it okay for us to move forward? All right, then we're ready for a roll call vote.
Mr. Kelly? Mr. Cromer?
Aye.
Ms. Harris? Mr. Swope? Ms. Pierce?
Aye.
Mr. Land?
Aye.
Approved.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think,
Only for item number 5, and then maybe we could take a short break.
yes, item 5, which is the 2023 Governmental Accounting Standards Gas 67 Actuarial Valuation. Also Andy Young?
Yes, so I think I will make it very quick. Whereas if you look at the two reports, the one that the board has just adopted on the valuation, I mentioned the fact that we don't want to use the market value of assets and in setting the employer's contribution rate. However, for financial reporting purposes, market value of assets, which is also referred to in our report as the plan's fiduciary net position, is the only way that would be approved by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. So you almost have to leave behind what I just said, and for the purpose of doing the financial reporting, and later on, we'll take the results from the GASB 67 report and utilize the results to provide pension expense and also an allocation of the liability among the 3 different employers. We will have to use the market value of the plan fiduciary net position. So if you look at the valuation report, there's already a line item where we developed the UAAL using the market value of assets of the plan fiduciary net position. They're very close to the numbers that is in our GASB 67 report. The only reason why it's not the same is maybe a few $100,000 has to do with the fact that some of our members from general plan have actually transferred to a safety classification, and they can actually purchase the service and have all the service be counted. So something along those lines. So for financial reporting purposes, we have to do it some other fashion, and that's really the only reason why the two numbers are not identical. The bottom line is almost, I hate to use the word, the board almost have no flexibility in deciding which method you want to use because they are all dictated by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. So we follow the standard, and that's the only way that we can get our auditors to put the big stamp of approval on the financial results. So I think that may be the reason why it's an informational item, is just we follow the accounting rules, we use the market value of assets, we modify the liability a little bit to account for some of our members have a history where the benefit is not all from one tier and along those lines. And I think that's the report in a nutshell. And there are other good pieces of information because the accountant also said, well, if we were to change the discount rate, I keep saying, well, 6.5% is the discount rate, but one piece of information we are required to put into the Governmental Accounting Standards Board 67 report is, they asked, well, what if the discount rate were to be increased to 7.5%, or what if the discount rate were to be reduced to 5.5%? Each way is going 100 basis point or 1%. How is that going to change the liability? So I think that could be a good piece of information to have, just in case some of the board members got asked, well, what happened if they actually were to recommend later on? We're not going to do that, but if they actually were to come in and you and recommend a 0.25% or 0.5% or 1% increase or decrease in the discount rate, how is that going to change liability? I think that is a piece of information, a good piece of information you can get from the GASB 67 report.
Okay. Is there any board discussion on this item?
Mine's less on this item, and I hope you pass along our best wishes to Paul and a long and prosperous retirement. He will be missed.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there any public comment?
There is no public comment.
Okay, then I believe that there is no further action to take. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And at this time, we'll take a short break, and let's get back here. I don't know how short. We do have some other consultants here. Can we get by with 10 minutes? Let's come back at 10:15. Okay, let's get underway here again. The next item is item 6, investment matters, and the first item on that will be a educational presentation on benchmarking presented by Robert Reveles.
Thank you, trustees. Judy's going to share the screen for us here. And what we've got for you this morning is a benchmarking education and a little bit of an intro to our potentially new international benchmark allocation, the MSCI World ex-US Index. If we go to slide 2, we'll try to get through this pretty quick. Try to get it a half an hour. There's a lot of detail. We might not go into all the detail. Certainly, if a trustee has a question, you can email me. We can talk about that later. But first slide here, just to show you that I didn't make all this gobbledygook up. It came from the CFA Institute and Morgan Stanley Capital International, MSCI. So let's flip to the next page, and this is our outline for the presentation. We're going to ask, what is a benchmark? How are they used? What are the types of benchmarks? What are the properties and qualities of a valid benchmark? Just so you're aware that those are things, that there are properties and qualities of valid benchmarks. We're going to talk about peer groups, market styles, market style indexes, and we're going to end with the MSCI World ex-US Index. So on the next page, we ask, what is a benchmark? And so a benchmark is really just a point of reference against which we can compare different things. An investment benchmark, as shown here, is often a group of securities that are going to characterize a manager's preferred universe of securities. A benchmark can also be an absolute rate of return, like our actuarial rate of return. That's an absolute rate of return. And it might be a peer group. It might not be. That's debatable, as we're going to see going through here. For asset owners, benchmarks provide the set of assets that can be considered for investment and acceptable levels of risk. Let's go to the next slide here. The first question we're going to try to ask is, how do we distinguish between a benchmark and a market index? A market index can be thought of as a certain market segment or a certain asset class. You most commonly see market indexes as benchmarks when you're looking at a passive manager, or there's some kind of a passive index. In this example, I'm calling out the iShare Core S&P 500 ETF, which is a strategy that is attempting to follow the S&P 500 index. And so in that case, the question would be, well, what's the strategy they're actually trying to do? When a strategy is actually trying to correspond to price and yield activity of a certain market segment, that would be a case where you want to be using a market index as a benchmark. We're going to see later in the report that that's not necessarily always the case. So keep in mind, what's the objective of the fund? If the investment objective of the fund is to track the performance of a broad market index, then that benchmark is likely appropriate. The broad market index is usually thought of as a broad market barometer. It doesn't necessarily represent the investment process of the managers. So indexes and benchmarks are formulated differently, and they are not necessarily the same thing. Let's move to the next slide. Slide 6 shows why we would use different types of benchmarks. Reference point for a portfolio owner is one. That's something for us to consider. It communicates information to the investment manager. It communicates, it's for communication purposes from the Board of Retirement to consultants like Callan. We would use it to evaluate and identify portfolio risk exposures. We would use it to interpret past performance. It helps us determine what is the objective of a fund. It helps with manager selection and appraisal. That's something that we're going to get deeper into at next month's meeting. It allows investment investment funds to market certain products, and it shows compliance with laws and regulations. And I've got this note here down at the bottom. Throughout the presentation, or when you're reviewing these type of documents, you want to think, does the benchmark reflect the investment process, and is it appropriate for us as an investor? On the next slide, slide 7, we've got the different types of absolute returns. Well, we've got the different types of benchmarks, I'm sorry, and I list them here. Absolute return, that's just a minimum target return. It can be 1%, 2%, 5%, 10%. Our actuarial rate of return is 6.5%, so that's something that we just saw in the valuation. We've got manager universe, can be another type of benchmark, and I've listed some of those. We've got broad market indexes, we've got style indexes, and we've got custom benchmarks, without getting into all of what those are. Again, we kind of ask the question, you know, the benchmark should be reflective of the investment process and be appropriate to the investor. On the next slide here, slide 8, this is one of the important slides here to consider. These are the properties of a valid benchmark, according to financial literature. So they should be unambiguous, which means that securities should be clearly defined. They are clearly identifiable. They should be investable. A valid benchmark should be investable. That's going to be, is it actually possible to hold it in a passive investments is sort of another way to think about that. They need to be measurable. You have to be able to measure it on a reasonably frequent or timely basis. They need to be appropriate in terms of the manager's style or expertise. You wouldn't necessarily want to have an equity benchmark against a core fixed income manager. They need to be reflective of the manager's investment opinion. The manager should be aware of the securities that constitute the benchmark and the factor exposures related to those securities. They need to be specified in advance. They must be constructed prior to any evaluation period so that the manager is not judged against a benchmark that's created after the fact. That's just not particularly fair. And then finally, they need to be accountable, meaning the manager should be willing to be held to that investment universe or benchmark. So these are the things that you want to keep in mind when we're talking about what a valid benchmark should be for us or an investment manager. Let's go to the next slide here. So slide 9 talks about how do we tell the quality of a benchmark? Just because you have a valid benchmark doesn't necessarily mean it's a quality benchmark. And so these are some technical terms for you. I won't go in depth on them, but for each one of these, there's significant more amount of detail related to any of these. Something I would call out for trustees is the turnover, sufficiently low turnover within a benchmark. That's something that you do want to keep in mind when you're reviewing any sort of benchmark or investment fund activity. Let's go to the next slide here, slide 10. So naturally, once we determine the quality of a benchmark and the validity of a benchmark, we sort of want to ask the question, well, a lot of folks will ask the question, well, how was this strategy compared to other investment strategies within the same universe? And so this is typically what's thought of as a peer group. Peer groups are natural, simple to understand, and a lot of people use them to compare performance. And we've sort of talked about this a little bit in terms of watch list criteria, so I've got that in a question mark in parentheses here. But I do want to underscore to trustees that it's a peer group may not always be a valid benchmark. And so if we move forward here to the next slide, we're going to look at the criteria, the validity criteria related to peer groups. And as the slide shows, there's really only one of these validity criteria that are generally passed, I would say, and then two of them are not. So usually the peer group's not unambiguous, they're not investable, they're generally not appropriate across investment strategies or managers, and they're generally not specified in advance. And part of the reason for that is because they're constantly changing. The specified in advance one, I think, is probably the biggest issue. You've got strategies that can significantly under or overperform depending on how the manager chooses to weight versus whatever peer group or benchmark you're looking at. And so this creates wide dispersion in certain segments of the market. We're going to see that a little bit later. Let's move on to the next slide here. Slide 12? Slide 12. So the peer group, here's the problem with the peer group creation is that it's somewhat subjective, and I haven't necessarily talked to Callan about all of their peer groups, but we're going to see an example of that a little bit later. But the peer group creation process can be subjective. It can be larger or smaller. If a manager has influence over what peer group they're placed into, that would be a cause for concern from the asset owner's perspective. Does the peer group accurately reflect the specific risks in the strategy? That can be an issue. Peer groups are obviously susceptible to survivorship bias depending on how the peer group's constructed and over what period you're looking at. And finally, peer groups are really subject to some herding behavior because of inaccurate conclusions about because of maybe a hot sector. So you could have a sector where nobody's investing in IT, information technology, let's say, but we as an asset owner, we're still expecting to have some sort of information technology exposure. There could be a case where, because the market doesn't believe, the market believes that those stocks are generally overvalued, nobody wants to be in them. That's not necessarily the case that we're in today, but it could happen. Let's go to the next slide. So regardless of these issues, peer groups are still used by people as a benchmark, but it's something to consider. It's only one thing to consider. If you look at a lot of other watch list criteria, for example, you're going to see that most of those criteria actually call out specifically performance related to median manager within a universe. So I just want to caution trustees that while that sounds like it could be a reasonable benchmark to use, there is some care involved in peer group benchmarking and how you want to compare those. So let's move to the next slide. Here's an example of a peer group chart from Callan. This is from June 30, and this is the S&P 500 index. So two things I would point out for trustees when you're looking at these types of charts here, a quartile chart, is it's always interesting to notice the height of the box. Is the box very squished, very small, very short, or is it very tall? So in the last year column, we can see a relatively tall box here. If you look at the 3-year or the quarter boxes, they're a little bit shorter. So that just shows us the dispersion of the performance. And the other thing you want to notice is what line, there's 3 different lines within the box, and what line is our benchmark or our fund, where are they located there? And in this case, they're basically in the same spot, but it's interesting to note, is it higher to the box? Is it in the higher portion of the box? Is it in the lower portion of the box? And what's the dispersion? So in the last quarter, we can see that The rank there is 30. Callan's very nice. They have a number there. You don't have to guess what percentile it is. We're in the 30th percentile, and that's in the top part of the box. And so we can see that for the last quarter in the large cap core mutual fund category per Callan, most of the managers underperformed that benchmark, and it looks like there's quite a few underperforming because that box, there's a lot less box down below the strategy than above it. If that makes sense. Let's go to the next slide here, slide 15. And so we're gonna ask the question
Robert?
about, yeah.
On the last slide, we've seen some where those are completely outside of the box, or am I wrong? I'm misremembering that.
We could have. I mean, they would probably. Maybe I'm remembering one where they're at the top in certain periods, or yeah, at the very bottom. I don't know if they were outside the box, but
That may just be from my memory. I thought I'd seen some points on that outside the box, and I don't know what that means. Oh, so it'd be outside the 10th to the 90th. So it'd be in the top 10% or the last 10%. Thank you.
do you remember correctly? Slide 15 here. So the most popular way to assess portfolio manager performance is to compare it with a market index that's generally recognizable to the public. There are thousands of different indexes available for regions, countries, asset classes. They're all made by different organizations. Some of them are exchanges, some are investment banks, and we know a lot of them. We've seen a lot of these throughout the years. The most popular providers, MSCI, FTSE, Russell, S&P, Dow Jones, and Bloomberg. I've listed some of the popular indexes here, and I've also listed our asset class indexes for the portfolio. We move to the next slide. We're going to ask, well, what types of market indexes or style indexes can we use? And here's a listing of a few of them. Asset allocation proxy and investment mandate, performance benchmark, portfolio analysis, what was the market sentiment, what's the basis for an investment vehicle. So let's talk briefly about the asset class index construction, which is on the next slide, slide 17. Asset class indexes are constructed by determining what are the eligible securities, what are the index weightings going to be, and how are we going to maintain those securities and those weightings. That's reconstitution and rebalancing. On the next slide, we're sliding into defining eligible securities. And so there are a number of ways to define eligible securities, but initially, stocks of the universe need to be identified in some way. The rules should increase investability of the index, meaning that it should be possible for investors to buy and sell securities within that index. The inclusion criteria can reduce the number of securities to make the universe more manageable. And some of those rules can be different for any given provider. Here we list some of those typical rules of what might be included as an eligible security or what wouldn't be. And there's quite a list here. There's probably even more. This is just a short example. Once you define the securities, then you need to say, well, how are we going to weight all these securities? So there are multiple different ways to weight securities, but these are the first two are the most popular. The The bottom two here, they're less popular, but we have seen them before. We've actually had an equal weighted S&P 500 strategy here in the portfolio. But the most common way is capitalization weighted. The second most popular way is price weighted. I've got some examples of those. The Dow Jones, in case nobody knew, is a price weighted index, and the Nikkei is also price weighted index, a Japanese. Going on to the next slide, there is a problem with capitalization weighted indexes because you can't always buy all the shares and hold them. Not every investor is going to be able to hold them at market weights. And so there's a solution is to make an adjustment so that that can be done. That's called a free float adjustment. So we mentioned that. The next slide, we move to the next slide. This is index maintenance. As the market is changing over time, those companies grow, shares become available and unavailable, and so the index provider has to maintain the investability of the index. And so they do that through reconstituting and rebalancing. Reconstituting excuse me, so reconstituting and rebalancing is mandatory because of changes. There are corporate actions that happen related to buybacks, secondary offerings, spin-offs, stock distributions. We've got dividends. Companies pay out dividends. Sometimes they're paid out, sometimes they're reinvested. And so those change, they change the amount of shares available for purchase or in the market. And there are also suspension rules related to that. If we move to the next slide, this slide mentions there are construction trade-offs related to index construction. And those trade-offs are completeness versus investability, reconstitution, rebalancing versus turnover, and rules versus judgment. If we look at the first trade-off, completeness versus investability, being complete implies that all the stocks are available for all market participants. And while that might be the case in some instances, it's often not the case in practice because a lot of smaller companies are more illiquid than others. The other issue with that is in terms of a global market, investability wouldn't necessarily equate with liquidity because in some countries, the government can impose restrictions for non-domestic investors. The more complete an index is, the broader and more diversified performance is. And so in a perfect world, you want to have a fully complete index, but again, you can't necessarily get that while keeping this investability requirement for a valid benchmark. If we move to the next slide, reconstitution, rebalancing versus turnover. So I don't think I mentioned we saw the word reconstitution before, but that's actually the process of adding or dropping securities from an index. Rebalancing is adjusting the weights for those securities that are in the index. Just to mention that. Particular size and style indexes are less frequently reconstituted. So an index that maybe has a set number of securities, like the S&P 500, that would be rebalanced. That would be rebalanced less than something like a larger security that doesn't. A larger index that doesn't have a number set in terms of included securities. Rebalancing is very important in the international indexes because these free float adjustments, investors need to be able to actually, investors need to be able to buy and sell the securities, and so If a certain country has rules related to who can and can't buy and who can and can't buy in terms of volume, those rebalancing considerations for an index provider take more precedence. On slide 25, the final trade-off here, rules versus judgment. Security prices rise when they are added to an index, or they fall when they're removed from an index. Luckily, a lot of these popular providers have transparent and objective rules that allow investors to predict the changes for new constituents to the index. In fact, most of the popular providers like State Street or BlackRock, they have whole teams of people that are looking at these rules, and they are planning well in advance of quarterly or annual rebalances to try to determine what they think, what they expect those rebalanced companies are going to be. And we'll probably talk to them later in this year. So we'll have an opportunity to ask them about their process when we speak with them. So let's finish up with a couple slides here, and I'm going to skip over to, well, I guess this is good, yeah, page 26. So there are different weighting schemes for each of these indexes. There's market cap weighting, price weighting, equal weighting, fundamental weighting, and optimization weighting. And let's go to the next slide, and then we'll cut to the chase here. The next slide goes over the market cap weighted weighting scheme. And this uses market capitalization to weight companies. This often involves a float adjustment for the for whatever company you're considering for inclusion. And the big benefit for this is that this is the only index that all investors in a market could hold due to the float adjustment. It requires less rebalancing generally. The two disadvantages here are that they can be overly influenced by overpriced securities, and they can be heavily concentrated. Now, this is something that is talked about currently today. The S&P 500 has 9 or 10 companies that are something like 35% of the makeup of the index. And so that's happened, I think it's happened maybe one other time in the last 20 years for one other period. I believe it was in the early 2000s. And so this happens, and this is a disadvantage of a cap weighted. But really, cap weighted is because it is the only index that all investors in a market would be able to actually hold. This has sort of become the standard for most benchmarks and indexes. And so let's slide forward to slide 32. Well, 32. Just to call it out again, the capitalization weighted float adjusted indexes are likely the best use for a benchmark because they're easily mimicked, they're easy to track, they're the only index that all investors can actually hold and trade. And so for these reasons, they're pervasive. On the next slide here, we go through briefly, are they valid? And if we consider all those previous criteria that we had already looked at, we can see that they are all yes, and that is indeed the case. So let's move 2 more slides. Can we go to 36? We'll go to 36. So the new index and the new structure that we're going to be talking about next month is the MSCI World ex-US Index. And this slide shows at the highest level how that index is constructed. It starts with their base Global Investable Market Index, that's all investable stocks all over the world, and then they exclude emerging markets and frontier markets, and then they exclude the US, and what you're left with is 22 different countries in the developed markets, not including the US. So slide 37, 38, and 39 and 40 we can skip over, but those slides just give some background on the maintenance involved in this particular index. It gives a little background on the global industry classification sectors, and it talks about the construction of that index. So you can read that when you have some free time. But let's look at the final couple slides here. On this slide, we can see what the index is capturing, which is 85% of the free float adjusted market capitalization in each country. This is for October 31st. And we've got the market capitalization of the index, and we've got the top 10 constituents here on the right-hand side. One thing I guess I would point out on the index characteristics on the left-hand side is the average market cap of 22.9 billion versus the median of 10.4. That's indicating to us that we've got a lot more large companies here than small companies. The average is greater than the median. And then the other thing that's sort of interesting to note on the constituents here is out of the top 10 constituents, you've got 4 of them in the healthcare sector. So that's sort of interesting. If we look at the next slide, this shows factor exposures, key factor exposures that we've seen before: value, size, momentum, volatility, and yield. And there's sort of 3 standout lines here: the size, the momentum, and the volatility factors are standing out. And the underweight to low size means there are larger companies versus the MSCI World, which would be including the US. And the momentum shows fewer rising stocks. There's a bias towards fewer rising stocks on momentum factor. And the overweight to volatility means there are more low-risk stocks. On the next slide, we see the sector and the country weightings for this particular index. And in terms of the sector, we can see it's pretty well diversified. Large financial, industrial, and healthcare exposure, but broadly pretty well diversified. Very low real estate exposure at 1.96, low utility exposure 329, and energy exposure of 531. I typically look at those exposures in whatever index or benchmark I'm looking at, because we've got significant exposure at the portfolio level, through our real estate and our infrastructure holding. So country weights on the right-hand side: the big countries: Japan, UK, Canada, France, Sweden, Switzerland, and that makes up about 65% of this index. And on the final slide, we can see all the countries included if you wanted to look at that. And so we can see there's Australia, there's some other countries in mainland Europe over there, Singapore, Hong Kong, some countries in the Middle East, Israel's there as well. So that will give you an idea about what this new index has, how it's constructed, how it's maintained, and what countries we would be moving for exposure in. I know that was kind of a lot, and we just kind of blew through some of that. We could probably spend 2 or 3 hours going through, you know, a bunch of those slides. So my apologies for just running through that. Comments or questions?
Yes, congratulations on your passing the first exam towards your certificate in investment performance measurement. I'm wondering, in your studies, did they have sort of classic cases for skewing or playing games with performance measurement that you would maybe want to comment on?
Well, yes, there are some. In terms of specific examples, I wouldn't necessarily want to bring those up, but things like, you know, large amount of transactions near quarter end or near month end, right, near the end of whatever period you're looking at, that's something to look for. Another thing that you would want to be considerate of that I look at when I'm looking at our managers are, you know, really where are these companies domiciled? There's debatable, and I've talked with Callan about this. You know, I personally think it's debatable if you have a company like NVIDIA in an emerging market index. You know, but I've seen that in EM strategies. So looking for certain companies that I don't necessarily believe should be in an index or a benchmark, that would be another thing to be sort of aware of. Market capitalization would be another one, right? You've got a small cap manager and they tell you, you know, we're never going to be getting into any companies, or we're going to be a forced seller around $3 billion market cap. Oh, now we look at their holdings report and we see that there's some companies in there and that are, you know, that have grown since then. And, you know, it could be that the manager held that particular company and it was 1 billion or 2 billion at the time. SMCI is an example recently, right? They used to be a very small cap company. Over the last 18 months, they've grown. You know, they've fluctuated all over, but at one point they had grown to be, you know, large enough to get into the S&P 500. Is that a small cap company anymore? Not by strict definition. And so, you know, knowing what company, the market cap of that company is, how the company got into the portfolio, that's another thing you might want to delve into. So those are a few things.
So in the past, there'd been some comments about, you know, how should we be evaluating our portfolio and should we use a specific benchmark for the entire portfolio? So this just was running through what constitutes a valid benchmark to help the board understand why we use different benchmarks for different portions of the portfolio as opposed to one benchmark for the entire portfolio. We build a custom benchmark based on the types of markets, into, you know, domestic equities, international equity, and fixed income to develop a custom benchmark for the portfolio.
Asset classes.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, do we have any further discussion from the board on this item? Is there any public comment?
There is none.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And we'll move on now to item 6B, Quarterly Investment Performance Report Summary. Claire, Talene, Callan.
This one has.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you on the rainy day. You all get home okay and your places aren't flooded or anything. Today is a standard fiduciary review of the performance for the investment program. At the end of the day, we have no immediate recommendations that we're not already implementing, and the portfolio is actually in pretty good shape. Hannah's going to spend a good amount of time talking to you about the fact that you're at a high water mark now and the overall performance looks pretty good. And then Claire will be able to hop in and talk about any detailed manager. But before we get into that, it's always good to talk about the capital markets a little bit. One, you hear about it, you think about it a lot, but two, it helps you put the performance of your fund, your managers, your asset classes into context when you're evaluating them. So we'll pull up the presentation if that's possible. And we'll start on, Judy, on slide 3, if that's okay. And on this slide, we always share with you what cumulative returns looked like at the end of the evaluation time period. So this evaluation time period here, we're talking to you about performance through the end of September. And a few things happened after the end of September. I don't know if you noticed, there was an election was that last week? Was that 2 weeks ago? That was 2 weeks ago, right? I mean, it feels like 3 months ago at this point. But a lot has happened since then. But this here is what the world looked like at the end of September. Big takeaway here, we've got that first column, that's the quarterly return across all these asset classes with a bunch of indices that Robert told you about a few minutes ago. The big takeaway is that across the board for the quarter, we had positive returns in just about every asset category. For the 1-year time period, even more positive returns with everything except real estate. And then if you look at 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, your investing horizon, really strong returns in aggregate. So it's been a really good time to be an investor, not just for the past quarter, but for the past 5 and 10 years. Another thing that I was really excited about in the quarter is if you look at the S&P 500, it has been really leading the way. Those magnificent sevens, the FANGs, it's been leading the way for a lot of capital markets. But in the quarter, you see that bonds, small cap, international equity actually all kept up, if not exceeded, the S&P 500. So that was great, and that's really good for you and most investors because you don't invest exclusively in U.S. large cap growth. You have exposure to it, you've got plenty of it, but you don't invest exclusively in it. So it's great to see the other asset categories doing well and helping lift the load for you in aggregate. Another thing I'd point out is that look at the 1-year returns. S&P 500 up 36%. Phenomenal. But the other asset categories are actually up a lot, right? International stocks up over 20% for the last year. Bonds up almost 12% for the last year. Ended September. So really strong returns across the board. One reason I'm harping on this and dwelling on it a little bit is we have a number of investors coming to us now and say, why don't we invest exclusively in U.S. large cap stocks, right? The other asset categories are actually doing really quite well, just not as well as the S&P 500. So we want to anchor people that you don't want to put all your chips in one basket. Eggs, you put eggs in baskets. You put all your eggs in one basket. And the other asset categories are actually doing quite well. Okay, so this is the world end of September. So what's the world look like on a quarter-to-date basis? So after the end of September, right? S&P 500 is actually up about 3%. Small cap stocks are up even more, up about 4%. We've had a huge turnaround in international equity markets. International equity is down about 7. Emerging markets are down about 8. And of that, about 5% of those declines is just due to the US dollar appreciating relative to those other currencies. And the other thing that's going on is bonds, since the end of the quarter, are actually down about 2.5%. So some of this reaction is the reaction to increasing interest rates leading up to the election, and then the concern of the market that interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, and inflation may not be completely under control with the new administration. So that's the way the market's acting right now. If you have a bunch of tax cuts, if you have tariffs, it tends to be inflationary. So that means the Federal Reserve can't decline interest rates, and the likelihood of having higher interest rates for longer goes up. Now, a lot of times the market acts and thinks about what's the most likely scenario, but there are scenarios that are better and worse than those most likely scenarios, so we don't want to always overreact to what the market is showing just today. So this is what the world will look like end of September, and then that's what the world looked like on a quarter-to-date basis. Let's flip ahead real quick to slide 4. The economics should drive capital markets over the long run. On the upper left-hand chart here, we're looking at GDP growth. GDP growth came in a pretty robust 2.8% for the quarter. It's been quite resilient. Inflation is coming down, but it's still up north of the Fed's target. That's on the right-hand chart. And interest rates are a lot higher today than they were just a couple years ago. Now, what's been interesting about interest rates of late is the Fed funds rate has been coming down. They've been cutting interest rates. But ever since they started to cut interest rates, long-term yields actually have gone up. Right? So at the end of this time period, you see the 10-year Treasury was at 3.8%. It's now at 4.4% today. So it's been a meaningful increase in interest rates, and that's why we have bond returns on a quarter-to-date basis down negative 2.5%. So that's kind of a big picture overview of what's going on in the capital markets. And maybe we'll pivot now, and we'll flip ahead to slide 10, and we'll talk about the overall plan, unless there are questions or comments. Okay. Yep.
So on this slide, we have the total plan growth. The first chart looks at the total market value over the past 15 years. And you'll actually notice I need to adjust the scale because we've reached over $750 million as of the end of the third quarter. So as of the end of the third quarter, total portfolio was about $754 million, about a $39 million increase over the third quarter, was about $715 million at the end of the second quarter. Throughout the quarter, we saw about $42 million in positive investment returns and a net outflows of about $4 million. There's one other thing I just want to point out on this slide. We had a slight revision for the cash investment return. It's showing a negative $12,000, but that should be a 0. But it does not affect any of the returns or rankings or market values throughout the presentation, but that is a typo. On the next slide, we can look at the actual allocation versus the target. As of the end of the third quarter, we had about 37% in domestic equity, 25% international, 20% fixed income, 7% infrastructure, and 9% in domestic real estate, all within policy guidelines, just slightly overweight infrastructure and slightly underweight domestic real estate. Looking at the actual allocation versus target over time, that shows the different asset class categories that the portfolio is invested in. Over time, the changes that have been made, you can see infrastructure was added. That's that yellow color, and that was funded by taking fixed income and international equity. On the following slide, we have the composition of the peer group. So we show each asset class category and where MSARA ranks in what portion of the portfolio is invested in each asset class. On the next slide, we look at the detailed asset allocation, so looking at the individual investment options within the plan. And all investment options remain in line with target. And at the bottom line, you'll see the total fund closed the quarter at $754 million, again, up about $39 million over the course of the quarter. In the investment return column, you'll notice mostly black. The only investment with a negative return was real estate, and just one of the real estate manager, it was Reef. Barings actually had a nice positive return for the quarter. On this slide, we have total fund performance as of the end of the third quarter. Thank you to Robert for going over how to read this chart. So the first column is just the last quarter. So the total fund was up 5.98% net of fees, outpacing that total fund benchmark return by about 58 basis points. So really strong outperformance over the last quarter and ranking close to the top quartile at the 26th percentile. Over the last year, you'll notice that the bar is a lot taller, so a wider range of peer group returns, and the fund had really robust returns up almost 20% for the last year. For longer term periods, looking out to 10 and 15 years, really strong performance, annualizing almost 8% and ranking above median versus the peer group. On this slide, we show fiscal year returns. So the first column just represents the first quarter because the fiscal year ended June 30th. So again, up almost 6% for the quarter, and then you'll see previous fiscal years. To Quincy's point, if you look at the 2021 return, the blue dot is above the rectangle, so representing that top 10% ranking versus the peer group. We'll flip one more slide ahead, please. This shows annual return versus risk. So the MSARA portfolio over the trailing 15-year period has achieved similar return to the benchmark, but with a slightly more level of risk or volatility. When we restructure the international equity portfolio, that will help bring some of that total portfolio volatility down. On this slide, we look at the key drivers of relative returns. So this shows attribution. The top table is for just the past quarter, and the bottom table is over the past 5 years. So looking at that top table, in the actual return column, which is highlighted in a blue square, you'll see the last quarter's return of 5.98%. And next to it, you'll see the benchmark at 5.4%. So what is driving that 58 basis points of excess return? It's your active managers. In the manager effect column, you'll notice 60 basis points of excess return, and the two biggest drivers of that were infrastructure and domestic equity for the quarter. For the 5-year annualized period, also outperforming the target return by about 25 basis points, and again, that's driven by your active managers, mostly in infrastructure and domestic fixed income over the period. On this slide, we show the asset class composites within the total fund. For the last quarter, MSARA's domestic equity portfolio returned 6.8%, outperforming the Russell 3000 index. So as Greg mentioned in his comments earlier, small cap stocks had a really great quarter, and our portfolio has a overweight to small cap relative to the Russell 3000 index. Russell 3000 index is about 80% large cap, 20% small mid, and the MSARA portfolio is about 70-30. So that slight overweight has been a headwind over the last year, 3 years, and even 5 years, but over the last quarter, it was a tailwind to performance. Within domestic equity, 75% is passively managed in the S&P 500 index, and the remaining 30% of the domestic equity portfolio is split between small and mid cap, and within each small and mid, growth and value. For the quarter, the growth managers outperformed and the value managers underperformed, but in aggregate, they remain good complements and outperformed the total benchmark. For international was, can we go back to the last page? I'm just working my way down the page. For international equity, it was up 8.35%, outpacing the MSCI ACWI ex-US index. That outperformance was driven by most of your active managers in international. Harbor, Oakmark, Mondrian, and T. Rowe all outperformed their relative benchmarks. And Mondrian, the international value manager, was the best absolute performer, as value did well inside the US and outside. Base income was up 5.4%, outperforming the Bloomberg aggregate benchmark. Both Dodge & Cox and PIMCO outperformed for the quarter and overall trailing time periods. Infrastructure was up 3%, a nice positive return for the quarter and the year. And then real estate was also up, barely up 18 basis points, but outperforming that Odyssey benchmark. Barings was positive. Barings had a good quarter, up 1%. And then Reef was your only negative absolute return, which was down just 55 basis points. That's a summary of what happened throughout the quarter. And I'll pass on over to Claire.
All right. So in the remaining slides, we have a section dedicated to each asset category. So the punchline's really been said. It was a good quarter. Returns overall look strong. We don't have any, immediate concerns that we aren't already making changes to, and I'll highlight some of those as we go through. But ultimately, we continue to monitor each individual manager's performance with the question of, is that consistent with our expectations? And then each individual asset category, how those managers roll up to the asset category performance, is that consistent with expectations and the structures that we've put in place? So starting on page 21, we have a snapshot of the total domestic equity portfolio. And if you look at the pie chart on the top left, it's a good reminder of how we've implemented the total domestic equity portfolio. So 70% of our domestic equity exposure is passive, achieved through an S&P 500 index fund. We take our active risk with the small and mid-cap implementation. So you have 2 small-cap managers, 2 mid-cap managers, growth and value within small and mid. The remaining charts on the page really take a look at how the total domestic equity portfolio compares to the benchmark for that market segment, which is the Russell 3000 index. There are no notable style divergences with one exception, and that's captured in the top right-hand chart. When you look at weighted median market cap, you can see the overweight to small cap that we've implemented structurally in the portfolio come through in that top bar there. So we know that's part of the portfolio, and that's an active risk that we continue to take, an overweight to small cap. In the recent quarter, as Greg and Hannah mentioned, that really paid off. Large caps or small cap stocks outperformed large cap stocks, and that was a tailwind to relative performance. As Greg mentioned, we've seen large cap US equity leading the way up until recently, and therefore that's been a headwind to relative performance, which you see come through in the performance that Hannah just reviewed for the total domestic equity portfolio. But ultimately, no surprises, this is the portfolio that you've implemented and it continues to perform within expectations. If you flip ahead 3 slides to slide 25, we capture performance for the total domestic equity portfolio at the top, and then each large cap equity below that, and then mid cap and small cap with performance for each individual manager versus benchmarks. We also show the peer group ranking on this page for the individual investment managers. Key takeaways for me are that for the quarter, again, the composite has outperformed. That small cap overweight was really a key tailwind to the outperformance versus the Russell 3000 index, but also that your mid cap and your small cap composites have done well. So we can look at each individual manager. Your growth managers did outperform this quarter. Your value managers trailed their benchmarks. Given their strategies and their implementation, that's actually not a surprise. But the mid-cap and small-cap composites, so the complementary nature of each of those 2 manager sets, small-cap and mid-cap, continue to do really well. The only fund that notably underperformed in the recent quarter was the Fidelity Low Price Stock Fund. Returned 5.4% versus a 10% return for its index. Ultimately, that was just a matter of stock selection in the recent quarter that was notable headwinds for them. But over longer time periods, they continue to outperform their benchmark. We have no concerns with this structure. You reviewed this earlier this year and renewed conviction in this structure and the managers. On the next page, we capture the international equity composite, and this is where we are in the process of making changes. So captured in the pie chart on the top left, the structure is currently implemented with all active management, and that's going to change. So we're moving to a developed markets index implementation, as Robert highlighted. That's going to be a little over 60% of the total international equity portfolio. And then emerging markets and small cap will be implemented with active management. So that structure, if you think about it, kind of rhymes with what you have implemented on the domestic equity side. So 4 of these active managers are going to go away. Of course, we continue to monitor them in the meantime. Similar to what I mentioned for the domestic equity structure, the remaining charts on the page really look at the total structure versus the benchmark for the international equity composite. And we don't see any unexpected style differences, with the most notable style difference is expected, and again, that's the overweight to small cap, which is captured in the top right-hand chart on this page. That is something that we're maintaining. So you're going to keep your dedicated small cap within the portfolio, so you will continue to see that overweight to small cap, even with the changes to the portfolio. And then flipping ahead 2 pages to slide 28, similar to what we looked at for domestic equity, we have performance for total portfolio and then each individual manager versus their respective benchmarks, and then the peer group number just below that. Harbor, Oakmark, Euro Pacific Growth, and Mondrian will all be going away from the structure. Those will not be in the structure going forward, replaced by the Developed Markets Index Fund. In the recent quarter, though, they all did pretty well. The one exception in the recent quarter was the Euro Pacific Growth Fund, which did trail its benchmark. It has a growth tilt to it. It was actually underweight to, or it is underweight to China, which was the most notable headwind to performance in the recent quarter. Kind of overall, your core and value managers fared well this quarter, and again, that one growth manager underperformed. But all of the managers continue to stay true to their strategies. We don't have any new concerns. I think moving forward with the new structure is continues to make sense, but of course, no immediate concerns on the existing structure. And then the last 2 asset categories that we'll cover, fixed income and then real assets. I'll actually jump to slide 31 to cover fixed income. The implementation of your fixed income portfolio is very clean, it's very simple, and it's worked really well. So implemented with 2 Core Plus managers, Dodge & Cox and PIMCO, which have each done well individually, and then you pair them together, they've outperformed the Bloomberg Barclays aggregate over all time periods shown. And then within real assets, you have 2 real estate managers, Barings and Reef, and 2 infrastructure managers, JP Morgan and IFM. Hannah touched on kind of the key pieces of performance there. We were pleased to see Barings have a positive return in the recent quarter. If you'll remember from previous performance reviews, they have a handful of office properties in the portfolio that had been written down to their loan value. So they kind of took the hit on depreciation. Those can't be written down further. And now appreciation within the portfolio has ultimately translated into a positive return for the quarter. So you see that depreciation hitting their 1-year return, if you'll flip to slide 34. But appreciation outweighing depreciation or in the recent quarter, so a positive return this. Reef did have a slightly negative return this quarter, so income not quite outweighing negative appreciation return. Longer term returns a little bit more in line with the peer group. And then the infrastructure portfolio continues to turn out a positive return. As Hannah mentioned, you implemented infrastructure as another diversifier within the portfolio, and it's truly been successful in that role since it. The last page I'll hit is page 35. This is really where we communicate out to you all of the other things that we're watching. So beyond just performance, What about the organization? Are there any changes to the team, kind of the philosophy, the process of each individual strategy? Is there anything that we're really concerned about? And the short answer is there's not much change here. So the only thing that's different on this page from the last time we spoke is there was an update to the team at Mondrian, but it's a change to the team that's going to take place in July of 2025. Your portfolio is moving on from this strategy and will likely implement that change before the personnel change at Mondrian takes place. So nothing truly notable beyond what we've talked about in previous quarters and things that we continue to monitor. Are there any questions?
It looks like Bering's sort of sticking out on page 35.
Yeah.
Obviously, you talked about the write-downs, which is hurting their bottom line.
Yep.
And it seems like a broken record with Bering's. It just keeps reskipping back to the start of the song, which I don't like. And I don't think many people do. If you look at the last 10 years, I think you have to go back to 10 years to even see positive gains in it. And at what point would Callan consider making a change with Bering's?
Definitely a fair question. In the first half of next year, we do plan to review real estate as kind of the next asset category that we're taking a deep dive look at. I think it could make sense to make some changes there. Potentially even, adding another manager is something that you could consider. The practical reality is that all of these Odyssey managers have exit queues right now, so you couldn't get your money out today if you wanted to. We do continue to meet with the Bering's team. I think there are things that, frankly, we're watching closely that do raise some concerns. But I would say, let's take a closer look at it next quarter or the quarter after.
We've been very deliberate in everything we do, and I think that's reasonable and fair. I was just curious if we were planning that.
Well, and so typically, I've been writing these update memos that kind of give the trustees a little more background into what the managers are doing in terms of acquisitions, dispositions, forward-looking strategy. My view is that Bering's has been way more willing to write down their properties, and that has, in two quarters in specific in the last 2 years, that's really dragged their long-term returns down. If you looked at those returns before the Fed started increasing rates, and that really started to impact in September of 22, that quarter, if you look before that quarter, we would have been more than happy with Bering's. Off top of memory, I think the net return was close to 9% at that time. So that would have been almost a 10-year period. This recent, activity with interest rates has really impacted them, and it's forced them, in my opinion, to change their strategies specifically for office assets. They've got, they have one more asset. So since quarter end, they've gotten rid of one of these highly impaired buildings through a sale, and they have one more in the portfolio that they're expecting that transaction to be sold and off their books by the end of December. So, on the one hand, that's going to position them to be able to pay some of the queue out. And on the other hand, they're effectively upgrading their strategy and moving out of these kind of old-fashioned Class A buildings. All the buildings are nice. They're just, the future is unclear if they're going to have full tenancy in them. They don't want to be involved in it at all. They'd rather be in other markets, whether it's self-storage or whether it's like a modern, like a life science type building, or industrial. And so in the next report, we can actually see some of that activity in the real estate report. So, the other thing to say with the Odyssey performance, I don't know what you all have heard, but what I have read and what I understand from other managers is that the cap rate within the Odyssey benchmark is too low. It's way too low in order to force a transaction. The prices are still too high when you look at the comparison benchmark, the Odyssey. Is that true or not? I don't know. Maybe that's true. Maybe you guys have more visibility. I only really see the two managers we have, but I will tell you that a 25 or maybe at most 50 basis point spread between the 10-year Treasury and the cap rate in an Odyssey doesn't make any sense. So that number is usually 150 basis points or more. It means that there's not enough write-downs in the benchmark happening. So I don't know. That's sort of just my perspective on that. I think there's a trough. I think we're near the trough, and I think Barings has willingly taken these losses. Yeah.
I think they're all fair comments, and I think should look at that asset category in greater detail.
Thank you.
Okay,
Any
is
other
there
question?
any further discussion on item B?
So,
Okay.
Claire and Hannah did a great job reformatting our presentation materials. We're trying to make it a little more summary and kind of get to the point, talk about total portfolio, and then have detail on each asset class, and instead of spending all this time. So we welcome any feedback, and we're glad to pivot the presentation, and we added the watch list too, right? So we're glad to pivot that if you have some suggestion, other information. Maybe Robert, send us any input.
I personally like the new layout. I think it's helpful. Provides a little more detail in just a fewer, in fewer slides. And I like that now there's a breakout for the mid cap and the small cap as a composite. I think that's good.
We always welcome.
Okay, so I believe at this point we need to call for public comment.
There is none.
Okay, so that moves us to item 6C, quarterly investment report, full report.
I
did we
think
do that?
that's
Okay,
really
those were
just for the
combined?
board's information in case they wanted more detail, but the presentation was just going to go over the summary. And again, there's the monthly report there also for your reference for the month of October. And if you had any questions on that, Robert can certainly address any questions you have on items 6C or D regarding the detail of the full report or the October monthly report. Other than that, I think we can move to 6E unless there's something Kellen wanted to add.
Well, so I would briefly add, at least on 6C, the monthly, the 6D, 6D,
monthly?
and Greg kind of mentioned it, the election, the Fed cutting rates have sort of caused the bond market to start kind of freaking out a little bit. And, that has strengthened the dollar, which has impacted the international markets. And we can see that in the monthly report here if you look on page 4. So you can see that, the international composite and the fixed income. On page 2, we took the opportunity to peel off some of those extra gains on the S&P and move them into fixed income. We're just trying to stick as close to our strategic asset allocation as we can. And given what happened at the time, it just makes sense to take some off the top and rebalance a little bit. So you can see that $4.3 million here. You're going to see that also in November as well, because things have kind of just continued, this has continued on, with the goal of trying to stick reasonably close to our strategic targets.
Is there any board comment on the monthly investment performance report section? I see that we're down this in the previous month, and you seem to think that that's related to the election, the interest rates, the uncertainties there. What about this month, Robert? Are we going to have, you can't comment on that, can you?
I think we're somewhere near the 740, 735 last time I looked.
Total dollars.
Total dollars, yeah. So I think we're just kind of riding flat here. We have no losses, no particular big losses, no particular big gains. We're just kind of floating along.
Floating on, okay. Is there any public comment or any further board discussion? First?
There is no public comment.
Okay, no public comment. So that brings us to E, 4E.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Robert.
Trustees, you've got the real estate characteristics report. Typically, I would have had a memo with some of that background on what's going on in specific with the managers in terms of acquisitions, dispositions, some of those risk stats related to them. I didn't have a chance to get all that done. I will follow up probably at our next meeting with those reports, so trustees will be able to read that. But sort of like I commented towards Trustee Cromer's comments towards Barings, I think that what I've seen is reasonable, and what they've said they're trying to do, they have done that. A 1% net return, that's pretty good right now, relatively speaking, compared to some of the other managers within the index. But this report here just shows the typical things we look at, the sector exposures, the region exposure, occupancy. So one thing I'd point out on slide 2 here, sector exposure, we can see that office number really starting to tick down here. And that's a function of their strategy and completion of making those sales, right? They had to write those assets down significantly and take a large appreciation hit on their returns, but that's allowing them to actually move the buildings at a market rate. So that's important for the strategy. And you can really see that tick down. Reef doesn't have quite as dramatic of a change in their sector exposure when it comes to office, but they continue to target apartment and industrial sectors for acquisitions and dispositions. Region exposure, the next slide, nothing too interesting there other than the Barings southern exposure sort of kicking up a bit, and that's just a function of really a function of sales, and so it's not that they're actively moving too much in and out, but if you have a large sale of a building in the west, which is what happened, that loss on one regional exposure is going to be an increase on the other. And so in that case, this is what we got with that. The occupancy rates, again, sort of the same deal. You can see on the occupancy office sector of Barings that number has sort of bounced around a lot. Occupancy has ticked up for them in the recent quarter because of the sale of these highly impaired other office assets. So that's why we see that number sort of kicking up to about 80%.
It's self-storage. I mean, that's a huge increase, isn't it? It seems like. Do you know why that is being realized in the last quarter or last 2 quarters?
They have 2 properties, and they've been actively investing in one of those properties. I think we're actually going to see that go down because they invested so much and they got it occupied. They stabilized that property down in LA, and now they're selling it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I think we're going to see that in terms of the sector exposure. I guess I should say we're going to see the sector exposure for self-storage taper off, and you can actually see some of that on slide number 2 as well. That's sort of a niche sector. It's not really a core thing. It's, it's a niche subsector, and they bought those 2 properties, dumped a bunch of money into them, got tenants in there, and are now gonna back out and find their next project. Yeah. And then the final slide here shows the net returns over the trailing 1, 3, 5, and 10-year periods. You can see the relative stability of about 3%, 3.25%, 3.5% on income for both of the funds. And you can see the appreciation, varies a little bit. 400 basis points, depending on the period that you're looking at. But sort of like I commented before, I think there's real debate on, are the cap rates in the benchmark realistic? They need to be realistic. They should be realistic, because you're not going to have a willing buyer of a property unless, that buyer believes they're getting a good deal. And if the buyer can get a 4.5% treasury, 10-year treasury, why would they want to buy your property at a 4.75 cap rate? And take on all that operational risk and uncertainty. People just don't want to do it. So my belief is that those cap rates need to rise another 100 basis points at least. And we could see losses in the Odyssey Index for the next 2 or 3 or 4 quarters, possibly.
Do we have any board discussion, any comments or questions at this time, buddy? I would make one quick comment. First of all, on this last slide, the return, the total is, and then benchmark, it's all a disaster. I mean, trying to look and find anything optimistic in here is fairly difficult. And the outlook, you said 2 to 4 quarters of about the same.
On the benchmark, definitely.
Yeah, on the benchmark,
Yeah.
But also the real returns, the total is of the actual, the actual managers, pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely comparable. It's an echo of the GFC. The GFC was maybe a little bit worse in terms of the time frame, maybe a year and a half. I think it was actually 8 quarters. This is that same amount and maybe a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah.
The other comment is on, I believe, slide 3, the west, south, the regions. Is that really even relevant? Because honestly, there's a lot of cities that I wouldn't even know, or I don't know exactly where would you draw a quadrant. I mean, it's kind of a funny way to break these down.
They could be broken down more, no doubt.
Yeah, regions don't really break. The economy doesn't break in neat little quarters of the country.
Well, it doesn't. I think the takeaway for me from these two is that our exposure is really the coast and the Sun Belt. Right? That's where we are. That's where our managers are. We don't really have any managers that are in the middle of the country. They may have 1 or 2 buildings there, but that's just for future discussion. Potentially you want to add diversification. You would want to find, if you're looking at just the U.S., strategies that are sort of targeting the middle of the country, and I've basically broken that out into north.
Right.
I mean, I'm calling the middle of the country north.
Okay. I mean, maybe a map with dots on it showing where the holdings are.
Yeah, we can do that. I actually had done a bunch of stuff. I did a voiceover video and everything. It was fancy. It was fancy, but we couldn't send it because it was too big. You can't send that document. But we have something like that where we can zoom in on regions and look at all the cities and the buildings and the types. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any other comment at this time? Do we have any public comment on this item?
There is no public comment.
Okay. Let's move on to item 7, fiscal year 24-25 budget update. Robert.
Trustees, you have the preliminary quarterly budget update and memo, reports and memo. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Do we have any questions on the budget report? No questions. Is there any public comment?
There is none.
Okay. Let's move on to item 8, administrative report. Doris, Executive Director.
Thank you, Chair Land. I wanted to give the board an update on the member status confirmation process that we've been going through. In October, MSARA did suspend the benefits of 2 members who we have been unable to make contact with after multiple attempts. We found out this week that one of them actually had passed in the month of October, so there is no loss to MSARA there, and MSARA will make the October payment to the beneficiary or the estate of the member. The other one we still have not heard from and have been unable to restore contact with family members that we had reached earlier. We are sending out 3 notices before any action is taken, and we also do attempt contact by phone and other options if we can track down family members or other things to try to get contact with someone to avoid suspension of benefit. But we did suspend 2 people. We've sent a total of 630 first notices, 64 second notices, and we're in the process of just sending out the additional 17 third notices marked as pending. We had actually sent out 12. So those continue to move forward on that project. The other item is because of Government Code 3511.2, my contract will go back to the Board of Supervisors at the December meeting to get ratification of the salary increase that's to be effective in December of 2024 because the salary increase of 3% exceeded the California CPI for the period. That was just an update so the board understands why it's going back to the Board of Supervisors on the 17th. This time of year is also when we do our fiduciary insurance renewal. Part of that insurance policy includes the waiver of recourse premium, which trustees can pay to obtain coverage to prevent the insurance company from recourse against any individual trustee. The premium for that is $9 per trustee. We would ask you to make the check payable potentially to the County of Mendocino. We're working out the bank doesn't like things going in under MSARA. So we'll give you specific details on that as they become available, but payment to Judy by the February 15th date, that gives you December and January's, meetings to make that payment of $9. And the January meeting, I would like to point out, starting with 2025, we will be returning to MSARA's conference room at our building on Kings Court to take advantage of the upgraded conference room with the new cameras and the individual microphones. So starting with January 2025, these meetings for the Board of Retirement will resume in MSARA's office at 625B Kings Court. Legal updates. The California Supreme Court granted a review of the Lacera versus the County of Los Angeles appellate court decision, and there will be an opportunity to file an amicus brief regarding this court case. I believe we may target a closed session in December. Is that correct, Jeff, to discuss this further?
If the board would like to give direction today to consider whether to file an amicus brief, we should do that in December to meet filing deadlines. So we're just looking for direction that you want to discuss whether to file, and we'd have a closed session in December. If that's good, just kind of a thumbs up or nod your head, or any concerns with that?
Okay, so it looks like board direction to discuss this further
you.
in December. Thank you. There were a couple of other minor updates. Our construction, we have 2 approved change orders so far. I do expect a 3rd one. There are a couple of costs that are outside of the figures represented on the report, which was just our contract with Kirby. If you have any questions regarding anything else on the admin report, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We have a question.
Do want to comment, cash of $9 is accepted, exact change, so.
Judy, will you accept cash?
Sorry, we don't keep a cash box, but if you provide us with exact change, this is the one time I make an exception and accept cash for that payment.
All right, roll of quarters.
I'll just say it's always good to have a paper trail.
We will provide you with a receipt.
Okay, is that the end, or do we have any questions or comments on this item? Is there any public comment?
There is none.
All right, so I believe now we are on to general board discussions. Do we have any board members who would like to discuss any items at this time?
I'll venture into the brief points about the SACRIS. I had attended the Monterey convention, and I really liked it, partially because even it was returned for me to the semi-old stomping ground, since I worked for the TV station for about a year and a half at Salinas. I liked the presenter, the moderator, Kelly DeMarco, who even works with some of the new people at KSBW on stage presence, and she did a wonderful moderating job. I found the cybersecurity risks and trends protecting the retirement systems and their members really interesting presentation. They had mentioned that for the large systems, AI, really, there is no A/B testing for your large scale systems for artificial intelligence, because you're just trying to vacuum all the information to construct the model. And that's also why some of the AI large scale applications sometimes don't do well with exceptions. And the handling of AI is prone to not doing exceptions well. And then there was the other one of the other sessions I attended, which was the private equity then and now by the speaker was the Deputy Chief Investment Officer, Texas Municipal Retirement System, who had said, now they are not in credit in China. That would be off limits for them, but equity, yes. So that's some of what I had picked up, and I felt it useful to meet a few of the institutional investor personnel there.
I also went to SACRS, and I would agree completely. It was not a waste of time. I think that every trustee who has an opportunity should consider going to one of the meetings. I got a lot out of it, and I also attended the private equity and private credit breakouts. That's an aspect, we don't have that in our portfolio, but it looks like almost everyone else does. It's a very interesting asset class. There was a lot of things to learn there, and it was a good time. And the community of people that are involved in on these boards is a very tight community. It's clearly a lot of people knew each other. Obviously, I didn't know very many people or anybody, but I did get to meet some of them, and I do recommend people make an effort to go. They do this twice a year, and I believe it's May 13th to the 16th is the next one. Is there any other board comment, non-SACRS or SACRS related? Okay, I believe that's a wrap then. Our next board meeting is going to be Wednesday, December 11th at 8:30 a.m. and that will be here, the last one here. Thank you.
The 11th is not the third Wednesday. I just want to point that out. It is the second Wednesday. We are meeting a little off cycle there, so be sure to note that we're here on the 11th.
Oh, and we are adjourned at 5 minutes to 12.